Hi guys, tonight we travel into a world of cold wind, restless horses, and grasslands so wide they seem to swallow the edge of the earth itself. You sit beneath a dark Mongolian sky, sometime in the 12th century, long before the empire arrives, long before entire cities learn to fear the sound of distant hoofbeats. The night air smells faintly of smoke and damp wool. Somewhere nearby, horses shift in their sleep, breathing clouds into the cold. The stars feel unusually close here. There are no roads to guide you, no stone walls, no church bells or crowded ports, only rolling steppe, bending endlessly beneath moonlight, and scattered tribes trying to survive another winter. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in tonight, perhaps share your location, your local time, and the part of history you enjoy most. It is strangely comforting imagining tired people across the world listening together, beneath different ceilings and different weather. The grass whispers constantly outside the tent. Now, dim the lights. You are born into uncertainty here. Not metaphorical uncertainty, real uncertainty. The kind that freezes children during storms and leaves families hungry when the herds fail. The steppe does not care about ambition. It barely cares about survival. A boy named Temujin enters this world around 1162, though even that date remains uncertain. Historians still debate the exact year. Records from the Mongolian steppe are thin, fragmented, and often written later by outsiders trying desperately to understand how one man changed half the world. At first, though, he's simply another child in a harsh landscape. You can imagine his early mornings, the stiff feeling of cold fingers, the smell of horse milk warming near the fire, leather hardened by weather, adults speaking quietly about rival clans and stolen animals while children pretend not to listen. Temujin belongs to the Borjigin clan. His father, Yesugei, is a tribal leader, respected but vulnerable like every leader on the steppe. Alliances shift constantly here. A friend this winter may become a raider by spring. Nothing stays settled for long. As a child, Temujin learns quickly that survival depends on movement. Families dismantle tents, load carts, follow grazing animals, and search for safer land. Home is temporary, even memory feels temporary. And yet there is beauty everywhere. The steppe at sunrise glows gold beneath low clouds. Herds move like pardos through tall grass. Rivers flash silver in afternoon light. At night, fires flicker against darkness so complete it almost frightens you. The world feels enormous. Temujin grows inside this moving world beside brothers, sisters, and his mother Hoylan, whose presence will shape him more deeply than many conquerors later admit. She is remembered as intelligent, resilient, and fiercely protective. She has to be, because childhood on the Mongolian steppe is not sentimental. Children learn to ride almost as soon as they walk. They help with animals, they endure weather that would kill unprepared travellers within hours. And violence exists nearby all the time. Raids happen suddenly, horses disappear overnight, tribal disputes erupt into bloodshed with astonishing speed. Loyalty matters deeply here because betrayal can leave an entire family starving beside an empty fire. Temujin absorbs all this quietly. You can picture him watching older men speak during tense gatherings, watching hands rest near knives, watching faces carefully whenever strangers arrive. Trust is fragile on the steppe. When Temujin is still young, his father takes him on a journey to arrange a future marriage with a girl named Bort. Political marriages matter here. Alliances formed through marriage help tribes survive. The journey itself stretches across open land beneath huge skies, dust rises beneath hooves, wind pulls constantly at clothing and hair, travellers sleep lightly at night. Temujin likely feels nervous during these negotiations. Perhaps curious too, he is still only a boy. Borte belongs to the Ongirat tribe, and by most accounts, the two children seem to form an early bond. Historians cannot fully know their feelings, of course, but surviving accounts suggest genuine affection later existed between them, which feels strangely tender considering the world surrounding them. On the return journey home, disaster arrives quietly. Yasuge accepts hospitality from a group of Tatars, longtime enemies. Hospitality customs on the steppe are important, almost sacred in theory, but rivalries run deep, and the Tatars recognize him. They poison him. The sickness grows worse as he rides home. You can imagine the exhaustion settling into his body, the growing silence among his companions, the fear nobody wants to speak aloud. Then he dies, and suddenly the world changes for Temujin. He is still a child, perhaps 9 years old, maybe younger. The exact age remains uncertain, but certainty hardly matters now. What matters is vulnerability. Without Yasuge, his family loses protection almost immediately. Allies disappear. The tribe abandons them. It happens with brutal practicality. One day people follow your father. The next day they decide his widow and children are liabilities. Extra mouths. Weaknesses. So Holan and her children are left alone on the steppe. There is no dramatic speech, no heroic rescue. Only silence after departure is one of the defining emotional wounds of Temujin's life. Hunger enters the family quickly. They survive by gathering roots, catching fish, hunting small animals, and enduring winters few settled societies could imagine. You feel the desperation in these years. Cold water around numb hands, thin meals divided carefully between siblings, constant fear of attack, torn clothing stiff with dirt and smoke, exhaustion lingering in everyone's faces. Holan keeps the family alive through sheer determination. Some accounts describe her driving carts herself, finding food wherever possible, refusing to surrender her children to starvation or rival clans. Her resilience becomes legendary later among Mongol storytellers. But legends often smooth away the misery. The reality was probably uglier. Children fighting over food, long stretches of uncertainty, shame, anger, resentment. Temujin grows hard during these years, though not in the simple way later myths sometimes describe. Hardship does not automatically create greatness. Often it simply creates wounded people. And Temujin is wounded deeply. At one point, tensions inside the family erupt violently. Temujin kills his older half-brother Bekta during a dispute, likely over food and authority. The details remain debated, but the emotional truth feels painfully believable. Imagine the silence afterward. Imagine Hulan's face. No grand music accompanies moments like this, only wind outside the camp and people trying not to meet one another's eyes. Yet even here, something begins forming inside Temujin beyond anger alone. He remembers abandonment. He remembers humiliation. He remembers what weakness costs. Years later, entire kingdoms will feel the consequences of those memories. For now, though, he remains a thin young man riding across empty grasslands beneath a sky that never seems to end. And somewhere in the distance, tribes continue gathering power against one another, unaware that history is slowly turning in the cold. Morning arrives pale and cold across the steppes. Frost clings to coarse grass beside the family camp, and the air carries that sharp metallic smell which comes before snow. Horses lower their heads quietly while smoke crawls from a small cooking fire that never seems warm enough. You remain inside a world where security lasts only briefly. Temujin is growing older now, leaner, more observant, and the softness of childhood disappears early on the Mongolian steppe, worn away by hunger, fear, and long exposure to disappointment. He learns to watch people carefully. That instinct matters here more than strength. The tribes surrounding him live inside a fragile web of loyalty and suspicion. Alliances form during feasts beside crackling fires, then collapse weeks later over stolen animals or wounded pride. Every leader fears betrayal because betrayal happens constantly, and Temujin understands betrayal intimately. The memory of abandonment still hangs over his family like smoke trapped inside felt walls. He carries it silently, but it shapes how he sees the world. Trust must be earned slowly, loyalty must be protected fiercely. Perhaps this is why certain friendships later become almost sacred to him. One of those friendships begins during adolescence with a boy named Jamuka. The two young men are said to become Anda, a kind of sworn brotherhood recognized deeply within Mongol culture. It is more than friendship, more than alliance, two people promising mutual loyalty through hardship and danger. You can imagine the ceremony beneath open sky, horses shifting nearby, hands clasped tightly, quiet vows spoken without witnesses beyond the wind itself. For a while, the bond appears genuine. Temujin and Jamuka ride together across the grasslands, sharing ambitions still too large to name aloud. Both are intelligent, both charismatic, both understand the steppe rewards ruthless confidence. Yet they are also very different. Jamuka comes from stronger aristocratic roots. He believes leadership belongs naturally to noble bloodlines and old traditions. Temujin, shaped by exile and poverty, sees value elsewhere. He remembers who stayed loyal when survival became ugly. That difference will matter later. For now, though, Temujin still struggles simply to survive. His family remains vulnerable, and enemies continue circling nearby. At some point during these years, he is captured by a rival tribe known as the Taichiud. Accounts differ on the exact circumstances. Some historians believe they feared his growing ambition. Others think old tribal grievances simply resurfaced. Either way, Temujin suddenly finds himself imprisoned. The humiliation cuts deeply. You can picture the wooden kangan fastened around his neck, heavy and awkward, forcing his movements into painful stiffness. Nights become miserable, sleep impossible. Guards mock him openly. He is still young, not yet legendary, not yet feared. Just another prisoner beneath cold stars. And yet something important happens during captivity. A guard eventually helps him restore. The details vary depending on the source, but the emotional truth remains striking, even before power. Temujin inspires loyalty in certain individuals, not through wealth, not through inherited authority, through presence. People notice him. The escape itself unfolds through darkness and tension. Temujin flees across riverbanks and brush while search parties move nearby. Water chills his body numb. Mud clings to his legs, somewhere dogs bark in the distance. The steppe feels endless at night when someone hunts you. But he survives. Again and again during these early years, survival becomes his defining skill. Not victory yet, survival. When he finally returns to freedom, something inside him has sharpened further. He understands now how quickly power disappears. He understands humiliation physically, not abstractly. And he begins building alliances with greater determination. One of the most important relationships remains bought. Years earlier, their marriage had been arranged formally. Now Temujin returns to claim his bride properly, bringing gifts and renewing ties with her family. There is tenderness hidden inside these moments. History often remembers conquerors only through bloodshed, but ordinary emotional lives still exist around them. Temujin and Borto likely speak quietly beside fires at night. They travel together across difficult land. They share uncertainty. Borto becomes central to his life politically and emotionally. Then catastrophe strikes again. Not long after their marriage, a rival tribe called the Merkit attacks Temujin's camp and kidnaps Borto. The assault is partly revenge connected to old conflicts involving Temujin's parents. On the steppe, violence travels through generations. You can imagine the chaos of the raid. Shouting in darkness, horses screaming, smoke thickening in cold air, people scrambling half awake for weapons while riders disappear into the night carrying captives. And afterward, silence. The kind of silence that follows trauma too quickly. For Temujin, the loss is devastating personally and politically. A wife is not only family here, marriage represents alliance, legitimacy, stability. Without Bort, he loses more than companionship. So he acts, This becomes one of the first major turning points in his rise. Temujin gathers support from allies, including Jamukha and an older tribal leader named Toghrul, sometimes known as Ong Khan. Together they launch a rescue campaign against the Merkit. The operation reveals something remarkable about Temujin already. He convinces powerful figures to support him despite his relatively weak position. He creates loyalty through personal bonds and shared purpose rather than pure status. Men choose to follow him. The rescue succeeds. Borta returns after terrible uncertainty, though surviving accounts leave many painful details unstated. Historians still debate aspects of her captivity and the timing surrounding the birth of her first son, Jochi. The uncertainty later fuels political tensions within the Mongol royal family. But emotionally, the reunion matters deeply. Imagine Borta stepping down from a horse after months away. Imagine exhaustion in her face. Imagine Temujin realizing how close he came to losing everything again. No dramatic speeches survive from that moment. Real reunions after trauma rarely sound elegant. Sometimes people simply sit together quietly because language feels insufficient. As Temujin rebuilds his household, his reputation slowly expands across the steppe. More followers gather around him. Some are drawn by opportunity, others by genuine loyalty, others simply by the instinct that history is beginning to move around this young leader. Yet danger grows alongside ambition. His friendship with Jamukha begins fraying beneath political differences and competing visions of leadership. Jamukha favors traditional aristocratic hierarchy. Temujin increasingly promotes people based on loyalty and competence. To struggling families and lower-ranking warriors, this feels revolutionary. To established elites, it feels dangerous. Tension builds gradually between the two former blood brothers. Shared meals become strained. Conversations harden beneath polite words. Each man senses the other changing. You feel sadness underneath it, because they once trusted each other completely. The steppe itself seems to reflect the growing fracture. Wide skies, bitter wind, endless distance between camps. Riders carrying rumours across open grassland while tribal loyalties shift like weather. Some nights, Temujin likely lies awake listening to horse harnesses creak softly outside the tent, wondering who will remain loyal when conflict finally arrives. And somewhere beyond the darkness, Jamukha is probably wondering the same thing. The wind feels harsher now. Years pass across the Mongolian steppe like storms rolling over open land, sudden and difficult to measure. Camps move with the seasons. Children grow older beside cooking fires. Horses collapse from exhaustion and are quietly replaced. Men vanish into raids and do not return. And slowly, almost without anyone fully noticing, Temujin becomes a serious political force. You sense it first through whispers. Travellers mention his name beside river crossings. Small clans discuss him cautiously during feasts. Discontented warriors drift toward his camp seeking opportunity, protection, or simply steadier leadership than older tribal nobles provided. His following grows because he understands something many rivals still ignore. People remember fairness, not perfect fairness. Temujin is already capable of brutality, but compared to traditional aristocratic systems, he rewards loyalty more broadly. A herdsman who fights well may rise beside noble-born warriors. Captured enemies sometimes join his ranks instead of dying immediately. For people long trapped beneath rigid tribal hierarchies, this matters enormously. The steppe begins rearranging itself around him. You can imagine his camp now larger than before. More horses tied nearby, more guards awake at night, more smoke rising into cold dawn skies, children running between tents while warriors sharpen arrows and discuss rumors from distant tribes. Power still feels fragile, though. It always does on the steppe. The greatest threat standing before Temujin is no longer hunger or obscurity. It is Jamukha. The old Anda friendship has finally broken apart completely. Accounts describe an eventual split between their followers after disagreements over leadership and social order. One famous story claims the division begins after a dispute involving where to camp during migration. Even small decisions carry symbolic meaning in tribal politics, and whatever the precise cause, the emotional reality is clear. Two men who once trusted each other now prepare for war, and the war becomes deeply personal. Jamukha gathers traditional aristocratic supporters who resent Temujin's rise. Many established nobles fear losing influence if Temujin continues empowering lower status followers. Temujin gathers those loyal to him personally. The steppe divides. You can almost hear the tension building during those years. Hooves drumming across dry ground, messengers arriving breathless at midnight. Fires burning late while leaders argue strategy inside crowded tents heavy with smoke. Nobody sleeps deeply anymore. The first major clashes between Temujin and Jamukha are vicious. One early defeat nearly destroys Temujin completely. Some sources claim Jamukha executes captured prisoners by boiling them alive, though historians debate the details. Even uncertainty can soften the atmosphere of terror surrounding these conflicts. Civil war on the steppe is intimate. Enemies often know one another personally. Former allies suddenly face each other across open fields beneath cold morning skies. Families fracture. Old friendships dissolve into suspicion and revenge. Temujin survives again through resilience and adaptability. Defeat teaches him quickly. He reorganizes forces, strengthens alliances, and studies how rival tribes fight. Unlike many aristocratic leaders, he listens carefully to capable subordinates regardless of birth. This gradually makes his army more disciplined, more flexible, more dangerous. At the same time, his personal authority deepens almost mysteriously among followers. Contemporary observers later struggle explaining why loyalty toward him becomes so intense. Part of it is practical. He rewards success generously. Part of it is emotional. He remembers hardship because he lived it personally. Many ordinary warriors likely feel he understands them in ways older tribal elites never did. And there is another quality too. Certainty. Temujin projects certainty even during chaos. On the steppe, where survival depends constantly on difficult choices, certainty becomes magnetic. Still, victory remains far away. The wars continue through shifting alliances and brutal campaigns. One season brings success, another brings betrayal. Tribal politics twist endlessly. Leaders swear loyalty one month, then defect the next. Even Khan, the older ruler who once supported Temujin like a foster father, eventually turned against him. That betrayal wounds deeply. Imagine the exhaustion Temujin must feel by now. Years of conflict, endless negotiation, constant movement, every alliance carrying hidden risks. Yet he keeps pushing forward. One confrontation after another reshapes the balance of power across Mongolia. Temujin defeats rival coalitions through superior organization and relentless mobility. His forces communicate efficiently across long distances. Command structures become more merit-based and disciplined. He is no longer merely surviving events, he is shaping them. There are nights after battle when the grasslands smell of wet earth and blood together. Riders search silently among bodies for missing relatives. Horses wander without owners. Fires crackle beside the wounded. Victory rarely feels clean up close. Temujin understands this better than most. Accounts from these campaigns occasionally reveal strange moments of humanity amid violence. Captured enemies spared because of personal bravery, loyal companions embraced after battle, grieving families folded quietly into surviving tribes. The Mongol world remains harsh, but it is still human. Eventually the balance tips decisively. Temujin defeats major rivals one by one. Jamukha loses support gradually as more tribes conclude resistance has become hopeless. Even former enemies begin joining Temujin's growing coalition, because survival matters more than pride. Jamukha himself finally falls into Temujin's hands after betrayal by his own followers. There is something tragic about the ending. The two former blood brothers meet again after years of war and suffering. Historical accounts differ in tone. but several suggest Temujin still feels genuine emotion toward Jamuka despite everything. Jamuka reportedly asks for an honourable death without bloodshed. According to steppe custom for nobility, Temujin grants the request. No celebration follows, just silence after a long chapter of violence. You can picture Temujin afterwards sitting alone outside camp while wind moves softly through tall grass. Victory has finally arrived, yet the people who understood his earlier life best are increasingly gone. Power isolates even successful men. In 1206, tribal leaders gather for an enormous Kurultai, a political assembly held beneath open sky. The atmosphere must feel extraordinary. Thousands of horses, banners moving in the wind, smoke rising from countless fires. Warriors from tribes that once hated one another now standing uneasily together. And at the centre stands Temujin. He is no longer simply a clan leader, no longer merely a survivor. During the assembly, he receives a new title, Genghis Khan. Historians still debate the exact meaning. Some translate it as universal ruler. Others argue for oceanic ruler or broader symbolic interpretations connected to vastness and authority. What matters is transformation. The fractured tribes of Mongolia now acknowledge one leader, at least officially. You stand there listening to the noise of the gathering carried across open grassland. Leather armour creaks softly, horses snort in cold morning air. Somewhere cooks prepare meat over smoking fires while political tensions still simmer beneath celebration. Because unity achieved through conquest always carries tension underneath. Still, something historic has undeniably happened. A man abandoned as a child beside the steppe has united the Mongol tribes through intelligence, charisma, violence, persistence, and sheer unwillingness to disappear. And beyond Mongolia's horizons, vast kingdoms remain completely unaware of what is coming toward them. The empire does not begin with trumpets. It begins with movement. After the Kurultai of 1206, after Temujin becomes Genghis Khan, the Mongol world settles only briefly into celebration. Horses still need grazing, rivalries still simmer beneath alliances, children still wake crying during cold nights, while guards pace outside camps. But something fundamental has changed. For the first time in generations, much of the Mongolian steppe answers to one authority. You can feel the difference immediately in the atmosphere of the camps. Messengers travel faster between tribes, supplies move more efficiently, warriors train together instead of raiding one another constantly. Old blood feuds are suppressed, sometimes violently. Genghis Khan understands a dangerous truth. If the tribes stop fighting external enemies, they may eventually turn inward again. So he looks outward. Beyond the grasslands lies northern China, divided between powerful states that view the steppe peoples with equal measures of fear and contempt. The Jin dynasty controls enormous fortified territories to the south, wealthy cities protected by walls that must seem almost unimaginable to nomadic riders accustomed to open horizons. Stone walls taller than houses, markets crowded with silk and iron, storehouses overflowing with grain. To many Mongols, these places must appear astonishing and deeply tempting. The relationship between northern Chinese states and steppe tribes has always been tense. Trade exists alongside raids, diplomacy beside mutual hatred. Chinese rulers sometimes bribe nomadic groups against one another. Steppe leaders retaliate with attacks along frontier regions. Neither side truly trusts the other. Now, though, the balance begins shifting. Genghis Khan reorganizes Mongol society with startling efficiency. Tribal divisions weaken as military structures replace older loyalties. Armies are divided into decimal units, disciplined and flexible. Officers rise through competence more often than noble birth. The system feels coldly practical. And it works. You can imagine the training field beneath grey skies, riders practicing mounted archery at full speed, commands shouted over pounding hooves, bowstrings snapping sharply through morning air, leather armour smelling of sweat, horsehair, and smoke. The Mongol warrior becomes something terrifyingly effective. Not because individual fighters are superhuman, because the system itself functions smoothly. Every rider carries multiple horses, allowing astonishing mobility across huge distances. Communication networks improve, intelligence gathering becomes systematic, discipline hardens, and Genghis Khan watches everything carefully. He rewards loyalty generously but punishes betrayal with relentless severity. Fear spreads alongside admiration. Followers understand opportunities within his empire are enormous, but mistakes can become fatal very quickly. There is very little softness left in him now. The years of hunger and abandonment have transformed into something sharper, more focused. Still, he remains deeply assertive to practical realities. He consults advisors. He studies enemies. He adapts quickly when strategies fail. That flexibility becomes crucial during the campaigns against the Jin dynasty. The first major invasions begin around 1211. You ride south now with the Mongol armies across harsh frontier regions where grasslands gradually give way to fortified settlements and defensive walls stretching across rough terrain. The contrast feels dramatic. The Mongols move lightly and quickly, carrying felt tents, dried food, and extraordinary endurance. The Jin armies depend more heavily on fortified positions, infantry formations, and traditional logistics. At first, many Jin commanders underestimate the invaders. That proves disastrous. Mongol tactics rely on speed, deception, and coordination. Riders attack suddenly, withdraw before counterattacks, then return from unexpected directions. Feigned retreats lure enemies into traps repeatedly. Entire armies collapse through confusion. You can almost hear the chaos during those battles. Horses screaming beneath arrows, drums echoing against hillsides. Officers shouting conflicting orders while dust clouds swallow visibility. The psychological pressure alone becomes exhausting. And then there are the massacres. This part of the story darkens quickly. Cities resisting Mongol conquest often face horrifying punishment after capture. Contemporary chroniclers describe mass executions so large they become difficult emotionally to comprehend. Historians still debate numbers in many accounts, since medieval sources frequently exaggerated for shock or propaganda. But the violence itself is undeniable. The Mongols use terror strategically. Resistance must appear hopeless. Word spreads ahead of the armies like smoke carried by wind. Some cities surrender immediately after hearing what happened elsewhere. Others resist anyway, either from pride, desperation, or disbelief. For ordinary civilians, the experience is catastrophic. You stand inside one captured settlement after fighting ends. The smell reaches you first. Smoke, wet ash, burned wood, blood drying on stone streets beneath summer heat. Survivors move carefully through silence broken only by distant crying. History often summarizes conquest through maps and dates, but real conquest feels intensely physical to the people enduring it. Families separated suddenly, shops abandoned mid-conversation, children hiding beneath carts while fires spread. The Mongol Empire expands through genuine military brilliance. It also expands through immense human suffering. Both truths must sit beside each other honestly. Genghis Khan himself remains difficult to read emotionally through surviving records. Some accounts portray him as pragmatic above all else. Others emphasize personal fury against enemies who resist. Perhaps both are true. He clearly understands terror works strategically. Sparing compliant cities while destroying resistant ones creates incentives future enemies cannot ignore. Cold logic mixed with violence. And yet life inside the growing empire also becomes unexpectedly ordered in certain ways. Trade routes gain protection. Religious tolerance often increases compared to neighbouring states. Skilled artisans and administrators are frequently spared and absorbed into Mongol service. Conquest destroys and reorganizes simultaneously. The contradictions feel enormous. As campaigns continue deeper into Jin territory, the Mongols face new challenges. Siege warfare does not come naturally to nomadic armies accustomed to open-field battles. Chinese fortified cities require different methods entirely, so the Mongols adapt again. They recruit engineers from conquered populations, learn siege technologies, experiment relentlessly. Failure becomes instruction rather than humiliation. This flexibility terrifies opponents more than simple brutality ever could. An enemy willing to learn quickly becomes very difficult to stop. There are quieter moments too during these years. Nights beside campaign fires where exhausted riders repair tack beneath flickering light, officers studying paper maps while wind rattles tent walls, captured musicians performing uncertainly before foreign conquerors. Empires are built partly through boredom and exhaustion. Months stretch endlessly during long campaigns. Horses weaken, supplies fail, rain turns roads into deep mud that swallows wheels and slows armies painfully. Even conquest becomes routine eventually. Still, the momentum remains unstoppable. By 1215, the Mongols capture Zhongdu, near modern Beijing. After brutal fighting and siege conditions, parts of the city burn extensively. Contemporary descriptions speak of enormous devastation. You imagine smoke hanging above ruined districts for days afterward. And somewhere beyond the destruction, Genghis Khan watches another great power bending beneath forces once dismissed as scattered nomads from empty grasslands. The world is beginning to understand that the steppe has changed. But even larger campaigns already wait beyond the horizon. The smoke lingers long after armies leave. It clings to clothing, settles into damp earth, drifts through ruined streets where dogs wander nervously among broken carts and shattered doorways. Even weeks later, survivors sometimes wake believing they still smell burning timber. Northern China changes under Mongol conquest. Not all at once. Empires rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. Instead, exhaustion spreads gradually through provinces and frontier towns. Refugees crowd roads carrying blankets, tools, frightened children, and whatever food remains, rumours travel faster than facts. The rumours are terrifying enough. You sit beside a roadside fire listening to displaced families speak quietly after sunset. Faces glow orange beneath weak flames. Someone boils thin soup in a blackened pot while exhausted horses stand nearby with lowered heads. Nobody speaks confidently anymore. Everyone has heard stories about the Mongols. Cities destroyed after resisting, garrisons erased, entire populations fleeing southward ahead of advancing riders. Some accounts become exaggerated during retelling, but fear does not require precision. Fear only requires possibility, and possibility now stretches across enormous distances. For the Mongol armies themselves, victory creates strange emotional conditions. Many warriors come from backgrounds shaped by poverty and tribal violence. Now they ride through wealthy agricultural regions filled with grain stores, workshops, silk markets, and crowded settlements unlike anything on the steppe. The contrast must feel overwhelming. Imagine entering a great northern Chinese city for the first time after years spent beneath open sky. Narrow streets packed tightly together, lantern light reflecting off wet stone after rain, the smell of cooked food drifting through market districts, bells ringing somewhere beyond crowded rooftops. To some Mongols, such places likely appear soft and decadent. To others, perhaps astonishingly beautiful. Conquest exposes both conquerors and conquered to worlds previously distant from imagination, yet the violence continues relentlessly. The Mongols refine their methods with disturbing efficiency. Cities surrendering quickly are often spared large-scale destruction, though tribute demands remain severe. Cities resisting face catastrophic consequences designed deliberately to discourage future opposition. The pattern becomes horrifyingly predictable. Resist, suffer, submit, survive, at least temporarily. You walk through one recently surrendered settlement where daily life resumes cautiously beneath Mongol occupation. Shopkeepers reopen stalls, farmers return to nearby fields under armed supervision. Children play again. though more quietly than before. Human beings adapt quickly because they must. A woman hangs laundry beside a damaged wall while mounted soldiers pass nearby. An old man repairs wooden tools outside his home despite visible exhaustion. Life continues awkwardly inside conquered spaces. History often misses these moments. The ordinary persistence after catastrophe. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan continues reshaping the empire administratively as well as militarily. He promotes literacy for practical governance. Messengers move along expanding communication networks. Laws become more standardized across tribal divisions. The empire grows organized. That organization matters enormously. European chroniclers later describe the Mongols almost like supernatural destroyers emerging suddenly from nowhere. The reality is more unsettling. Their success depends not only on ferocity but on administration, adaptability, and planning. They become frightening because they function effectively, and because Genghis Khan rarely allows emotional sentiment to interfere with strategic goals. One story from these years reveals his complicated nature sharply. During campaigns, he sometimes questions captured scholars, monks, or artisans personally. He wants useful knowledge, siege engineering, medicine, administration, geography. Curiosity exists beside cruelty. This combination makes him extraordinarily dangerous. There are evenings when Mongol commanders sit inside captured palaces studying unfamiliar objects beneath candlelight. Silk screens ripple softly in warm air. Ink paintings hang undisturbed on walls while soldiers outside sort through spoils of war. The conquerors themselves are king or exposure to settled civilizations broadens the empire culturally, even while violence tears populations apart. Interpreters, merchants, craftsmen, and administrators from conquered territories become woven into Mongol rule. Empires absorb as much as they destroy. Still, grief shadows everything. In villages across northern China, families search for missing relatives after battles. Buddhist temples shelter refugees sleeping shoulder to shoulder beneath incense smoke. Fields go untended because farmers have fled or died. The human cost becomes impossible to calculate fully. Modern historians continue debating numbers associated with Mongol conquests. Medieval records often exaggerate enormously, sometimes intentionally, yet even cautious estimates reveal devastation on a vast scale. Millions likely perish across decades of warfare, famine, disease, and displacement connected to Mongol expansion. You feel the emotional weight of that reality in quieter scenes. A mother cutting smaller portions from already thin bread. A child crying at the sound of approaching horses. A scholar packing books carefully before abandoning his home. These moments rarely survive in official chronicles, but they form the texture of the lived experience. For Mongol soldiers too, constant warfare carries psychological burdens rarely discussed openly. Many spend years campaigning far from home. Friends die suddenly beside them. Winter marches become brutal tests of endurance through snow and freezing wind. At night, camps often fall strangely silent after battle. Exhaustion replaces celebration. You hear only horses chewing dry grass and distant coughing from wounded men wrapped in rough blankets. Fires burn low. Armour lies stacked beside sleeping bodies stiff with fatigue. Conquest is physically miserable much of the time, and yet momentum keeps building. The Jin dynasty struggles increasingly to contain Mongol advances. Political divisions weaken coordinated defense efforts. Some local officials surrender early, hoping to preserve cities from destruction. Others resist desperately despite terrible odds. No clear path remains safe. Genghis Khan watches carefully for weakness everywhere. He understands that large empires often fracture internally under pressure. Fear spreads faster when governments appear uncertain. So the Mongols maintain relentless pressure. At the same time, distant opportunities begin attracting Genghis Khan's attention beyond China itself. Trade routes stretching westward through Central Asia promise enormous wealth and strategic influence. Muslim merchants move across these roads carrying silver, textiles, spices, and information between civilizations. Commerce fascinates the Mongols because commerce strengthens empires. Initially, Genghis Khan seems genuinely interested in stable trade relations with neighbouring states. Contrary to later stereotypes, he does not simply seek endless destruction for its own sake. He wants power. Trade can provide power more profitably than warfare. This matters because one disastrous diplomatic incident soon changes the direction of world history dramatically. But for now, you remain in northern China watching smoke drift above damaged walls while ordinary people attempt to understand the new reality settling over their lives. The empire born from hungry tribes on the steppe now stretches across immense territories, and still it hungers for more. The caravans move slowly beneath pale desert skies. Long lines of camels sway through dry wind carrying silk, silver, furs, paper, spices, and stories gathered from half the known world. Bells tied around harnesses chime softly with each uneven step. Traders wrap cloth across their faces against blowing dust while guards scan distant ridges for raiders. The Silk Road is never truly safe, but it is alive. For centuries, these trade routes have connected civilizations stretching from China to the Islamic world and beyond. Along them travel merchants, pilgrims, interpreters, scholars, musicians, fugitives, and opportunists. Cities rise beside the routes like islands in harsh landscapes. Samarkand, Bukhara, Otrar, places filled with crowded markets and shaded courtyards where strangers bargain in multiple languages beneath hanging lanterns. By the early 13th century, Genghis Khan understands how valuable these routes could become for the Mongol Empire. Conquest alone cannot sustain such a vast realm forever. Trade creates wealth more efficiently than endless destruction, at least in theory. So for a brief moment, something almost resembling cautious diplomacy emerges between the Mongols and the Khwarezmian Empire, a massive Islamic state controlling much of Central Asia and Persia under Shah Muhammad II. The situation feels tense but manageable. The Khwarezmian Empire is wealthy, urban, sophisticated, and deeply connected to regional commerce. Compared to the steppe world, its cities seem dazzlingly complex. Libraries, mosques, workshops, bathhouses, irrigation systems. A civilization built from stone, scholarship, and trades. Genghis Khan initially appears to want peaceful commercial relations. This surprises many later observers because it conflicts with the image of unstoppable conquest. But historical records strongly suggest he genuinely sought stable exchange at first. He sends envoys westward carrying gifts and proposals for trade agreements. You imagine the Mongol delegation arriving at one of the great Central Asian cities after weeks crossing open land, dust covering their clothing, horses exhausted, officials watching cautiously from behind carved wooden screens. Everything feels formal, careful, fragile, and then it collapses. In 1218, a Mongol trade caravan arrives at the border city of Otrar. Accounts differ slightly, but the governor of the city, Inalchuk, accuses the merchants of espionage, or perhaps some were spies. Mongol intelligence networks certainly existed. But merchants often gathered information naturally anyway. Trade and espionage blurred constantly in medieval politics. Whatever the truth, the governor seizes the caravan. The merchants are executed, their goods confiscated. When news reaches Genghis Khan, the situation still might have been salvageable through apology or punishment of the governor. Instead, Shah Muhammad protects Inalchuk and rejects Mongol demands for justice. Some accounts claim the Shah humiliates Mongol envoys sent afterward. One ambassador may have been executed, others reportedly had their beards burned. That detail matters deeply. Diplomatic envoys held sacred status across many cultures, including Mongol traditions. Harming them represented not merely insult but profound violation. You can imagine the atmosphere inside Genghis Khan's camp when the surviving envoys return. Cold silence, faces hardening beside firelight. Wind pressing against felt tent walls while messengers spread news quietly between commanders. Something irreversible has happened. Historians still debate Shah Muhammad's thinking. Perhaps he underestimated the Mongols completely. Perhaps internal political pressures shaped his decisions. Perhaps fear and arrogance mixed together disastrously. Whatever the reason, he has misjudged his enemy catastrophically. Genghis Khan does not respond immediately with blind rage. That is important. He prepares carefully. The coming campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire becomes one of the most astonishing military operations in medieval history, not simply because of its violence, though the violence will be immense, but because of the extraordinary distances involved. The Mongols prepare to cross deserts, mountains, and hostile terrain with terrifying speed. You stand beside the army as preparations unfold. Blacksmiths repair equipment late into the night. Horses are inspected carefully. Arrows bundled tightly against moisture. Officers study routes beneath flickering lamplight. The air smells of leather, smoke, sweat, and anticipation. Many soldiers probably do not yet understand the scale of what lies ahead. In 1219, the invasion begins. The Mongol forces surge westward in multiple coordinated columns, moving faster than enemies believe possible. Intelligence gathering proves meticulous. Scouts map water sources across barren landscapes. Communication between armies remains surprisingly effective despite enormous distances. The Khwarezmian Empire struggles to respond coherently. Part of the problem lies with Shah Muhammad himself. Distrustful of his own generals, uncertain where the main attacks will fall, he disperses forces across fortified cities instead of concentrating them effectively. This decision proves disastrous. The Mongols excel at isolating and destroying separated enemies, and psychologically, the invasion spreads panic quickly. News travels unevenly across the empire. One city hears exaggerated rumors about massacres elsewhere. Another receives conflicting reports about Mongol numbers. Fear fills the gaps. You move now through landscapes growing harsher and more haunting. Dry wind blowing across empty plains, snow lingering high in distant mountains, caravan routes suddenly abandoned except for scattered belongings left beside wells. The invasion feels almost unnatural in speed. One Mongol force appears unexpectedly through terrain defenders considered impassable. Another bypasses strongholds entirely, striking deeper into the empire. Cities expecting long preparations suddenly find mounted armies outside their walls. Confusion seems constant. For ordinary civilians, uncertainty itself becomes terrifying. Markets close early, families hide valuables beneath floors. Religious leaders pray publicly for deliverance while officials argue behind guarded doors. Nobody knows where the Mongols will strike next. And somewhere amid the chaos rides Genghis Khan himself, older now but still relentless. He carries decades of hardship inside him like forged iron. Hunger, betrayal, captivity, civil war, all of it sharpened into purpose. The diplomatic catastrophe at Otrar has become something much larger than revenge alone. It has opened the road toward Persia, Central Asia, and eventually much of the Islamic world. And the people waiting behind those walls still cannot fully imagine what is approaching through the dust. The desert feels endless. Day after day, the Mongol armies move westward beneath skies bleached pale by heat and dust. Sand creeps into boots, armor straps, food sacks, eyelids, lips crack. Water becomes precious enough to silence conversation. And still the riders keep coming. You hear them before you fully see them sometimes. The low thunder of many hooves carried strangely across open ground. Harness chains rattling softly. Horses breathing hard through dry nostrils while scouts scan distant horizons. The invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire unfolds with terrifying momentum now. Cities that once considered themselves secure begin collapsing one after another beneath coordinated Mongol assaults. Some surrender early, hoping mercy still exists within negotiation. Others resist stubbornly behind thick walls. Resistance usually ends badly. Yet the emotional atmosphere varies from place to place. Fear is everywhere, but fear expresses itself differently. In some cities, people pray quietly and prepare food stores. In others, panic spills openly into crowded streets. You stand inside Bukhara as rumours arrive ahead of the Mongol advance. The city is magnificent by medieval standards. Mosques rise above packed neighbourhoods. Scholars debate theology and science inside cool courtyards shaded from the sun. Merchants display silk and spices gathered from astonishing distances. The smell of bread drifts through market lanes. Children chase one another past water channels running beside stone walkways. Life still feels normal enough here. Until it suddenly does not. The Mongols arrive faster than expected. Accounts from surviving chroniclers describe shock spreading through the city as defences crumble. Genghis Khan himself reportedly enters Bukhara after capture, using the central mosque as a gathering place for the defeated population. Some later Persian accounts place harsh speeches in his mouth, though historians debate the exact wording. The emotional truth remains unmistakable. An old world is breaking open. You walk now through streets heavy with smoke after the conquest. Doors hang broken from hinges. Wealthy homes stand abandoned beside poorer districts already stripped bare by soldiers searching for valuables. And yet certain places remain strangely untouched. Artisans useful to the Mongols are separated from the general population. Skilled craftsmen, scribes, engineers, and administrators often receive protection because the empire needs their knowledge. Pragmatism guides many Mongol decisions, not kindness, pragmatism. Still, even selective mercy feels significant amid widespread destruction. For survivors, daily existence becomes disorienting. Familiar rulers vanish, local armies collapse, new laws emerge beneath foreign conquerors speaking unfamiliar languages. Imagine the exhaustion of trying to understand political catastrophe while simply searching for clean water or missing relatives. History at ground level feels confusing most of the time. Meanwhile, Shah Muhammad continues retreating westward, unable to organize effective resistance. His authority weakens visibly with every Mongol success. Governors distrust one another. Communication fails. Some cities surrender without meaningful coordination. The empire begins unraveling psychologically before it fully collapses militarily. Genghis Khan senses this weakness and presses harder. The Mongol campaigns reveal astonishing operational flexibility. Armies divide and reunite fluidly across vast territories. Generals receive broad strategic goals and adapt independently to local conditions. One of the most remarkable commanders is Subutai. You can almost picture him studying maps late at night beneath flickering oil lamps. Calm, methodical, patient in ways many steppe warriors are not stereotypically imagined to be. Subutai is not aristocratic by birth. Like several key Mongol leaders, he rises through competence. That pattern continues reshaping the empire internally. Merit becomes weaponized. Alongside Subutai rides another brilliant general, Jebe, whose name reportedly means arrow. Years earlier, he had once fought against Genghis Khan before joining him after defeat. The Mongol Empire absorbs talent constantly, even former enemies. Together, these commanders pursue Shah Muhammad relentlessly across Persia and Central Asia. The pursuit itself becomes almost mythic in scale. Mongol detachments cross mountains, deserts, and river systems with astonishing endurance. At times, the campaign feels less like conventional warfare and more like an approaching weather system impossible to stop. And everywhere, civilians endure the consequences. You enter Samarkand next. The city stands among the jewels of the Islamic world, wealthy and cosmopolitan, filled with traders from many cultures. Blue tiles gleam beneath sunlight. Caravanserais shelter travellers from distant lands. Gardens soften the harshness of surrounding terrain. Then the siege begins. The defenders include large numbers of troops, even war elephants reportedly obtained from India. Yet internal divisions weaken resistance badly. Some forces surrender early, others panic, coordination collapses. The Mongols exploit every fracture. Accounts describe mass killings after the city falls, though exact numbers remain uncertain as always. Medieval chroniclers often wrote with emotional intensity rather than statistical precision. Still, no serious historian doubts the scale of devastation. You feel it afterward in the silence. Not complete silence, cities are rarely fully silent, but a damaged kind of quiet. Smoke drifting through ruined districts, survivors moving cautiously around bodies awaiting burial, doors opening only halfway during conversations. People speak softer after catastrophe, and above everything hangs disbelief. How did riders from distant grasslands overthrow one of the great empires of the Islamic world so quickly? Part of the answer lies in Mongol adaptability and leadership. Part lies in Khwarezmian political fragmentation. Part lies simply in terror. Fear reshapes human decision-making rapidly during war. Garrisons surrender earlier. Alliances weaken. Rumours distort judgment. The Mongols understand psychological warfare exceptionally well. Yet even amid destruction, moments of humanity persist stubbornly. A captured physician treating wounded strangers regardless of allegiance. Families sharing hidden food supplies. Children still laughing occasionally because childhood does not vanish entirely even during disaster. These fragments matter. Without them, history becomes too abstract to feel honestly human. Eventually Shah Muhammad dies while fleeing near the Caspian Sea, exhausted and abandoned by much of his former support. Accounts describe illness, despair, and isolation during his final days. There is something bleakly tragic about his ending. An emperor once ruling enormous territories reduced to flight and uncertainty beside cold water under grey skies. But the Mongol advance does not stop with his death. Subutai and Jebi continue westward almost experimentally now, probing lands beyond the shattered Khwarezmian Empire. The world beyond Central Asia waits ahead, largely unaware that Mongol scouts already ride toward it through dust and fading sunlight. Ash drifts through the morning air like grey snow. It settles across rooftops, sticks to damp clothing, gathers silently in corners where market stalls once stood open beneath bright fabric awnings. Somewhere nearby, a wooden beam collapses with a tired crack, sending sparks briefly upward before disappearing again into smoke. You walk through the aftermath of conquest in Central Asia, and the scale of destruction feels difficult for the mind to hold comfortably. Samarkand has fallen. Bukhara has fallen. Other cities across Persia and Transoxiana surrender, resist, burn, survive, collapse, or some painful mixture of all four at once. The Mongol invasion moves so quickly that news often arrives beside refugees already carrying visible proof. Burned hands, bandaged faces, children too exhausted to cry anymore. The Islamic world of the early 13th century is sophisticated, urban, deeply connected through scholarship and trade. Great libraries preserve scientific texts from earlier civilizations. Astronomers chart the heavens carefully from observatories. Poets write by lamplight in crowded cities perfumed with ink, dust, and cooking spices. And now war tears through those worlds. You sit quietly inside a damaged madrasa courtyard, where displaced scholars gather around a shallow fountain still running weakly despite everything. Some discuss theology softly, others simply stare at the ground. Nobody fully understands what future remains possible. One elderly teacher runs trembling fingers along the spine of a rescued manuscript wrapped carefully in cloth. The gesture feels heart-breakingly ordinary. Human beings always try saving something. Books, jewelry, letters, children, memory itself. Meanwhile, the Mongol armies continue reorganizing conquered territory with unsettling efficiency. Skilled administrators are catalogued, tax systems adjusted, communication routes secured, military governors appointed. Conquest and administration unfold simultaneously. This is one reason the empire expands so rapidly. The Mongols do not merely destroy, they absorb useful structures wherever possible. Still, devastation remains enormous. Some Persian chroniclers later describe entire regions left depopulated after campaigns. Historians debate exact numbers fiercely, but archaeological evidence confirms severe demographic collapse in certain areas. War kills directly through violence, then indirectly through famine, disease, displacement, and economic breakdown. The suffering ripples outward long after battles end. You travel now beside a group of refugees moving southward through cold rain. Wheels sink into muddy roads. Wet blankets cling heavily across shoulders. A woman hums softly to calm a feverish child while older men walk in silence beside overloaded carts. Nobody knows where safety truly exists anymore. The Mongols seem capable of appearing almost anywhere, and psychologically that uncertainty becomes crushing. At the centre of all this remains Genghis Khan himself, aging but still intensely active. Surviving accounts suggest he maintains strict discipline within his command structure, while rewarding initiative aggressively. He demands results. He also demands information. The empire gathers intelligence constantly now through merchants, scouts, defectors, interpreters, and captured officials. Geography, politics, trade routes, rivalries, everything matters. Knowledge becomes another weapon. At times, Genghis Khan reportedly questions scholars and religious leaders personally. He shows particular curiosity toward medicine, administration, and spiritual traditions promising longevity or wisdom. This side of him feels strangely human. A conqueror responsible for immense destruction, sitting awake at night asking questions about philosophy and mortality. Perhaps power always sharpens awareness of death. There are evenings during these campaigns when the Mongol camps settle into exhausted quiet beneath enormous desert skies. Horses graze weakly after long marches. Armour dries beside low fires. Cooks prepare thin stews while officers review reports by candlelight. The empire feels less glamorous up close, more tired, more physical. Men cough from smoke inhalation. Saddles require constant repair. Wounds become infected easily in harsh conditions. Entire armies smell of leather, sweat, horsehair, mud, and old rain. And still they keep moving. One particularly haunting episode unfolds at Nishapur in Persia after fierce resistance and the death of a prominent Mongol commander related to Genghis Khan's family. The city reportedly faces catastrophic retaliation. Medieval accounts describe massacres on a horrifying scale. As always, exact numbers remain uncertain and likely exaggerated in some sources, yet the emotional atmosphere emerging from surviving chronicles is unmistakable. Rage, vengeance, total collapse of mercy. You stand afterward beside irrigation canals clogged with debris while smoke drifts across shattered walls under pale afternoon light. Survivors search carefully through ruins for hidden grain or missing relatives. Even the birds seem absent. The Mongols are building an empire that future generations will remember partly through terror stories passed between frightened communities. And those stories are not entirely inventions. Yet history becomes more complicated the longer you remain here, because alongside destruction, new connections also emerge unexpectedly. Trade routes reopen under Mongol protection after fighting subsides. Certain merchants travel more safely across vast distances than before. Religious minorities sometimes experience greater tolerance under Mongol rule than under previous regimes. The empire destroys barriers while creating others. Contradictions exist everywhere inside it. A Nestorian Christian advisor may serve beside a Buddhist official, while Muslim merchants negotiate taxes with Mongol governors influenced by traditional shamanistic beliefs. Cultures collide constantly. Some survive transformed, some disappear. You meet a young Persian scribe now working reluctantly for Mongol administrators after his former employer dies during the invasion. He copies tax records carefully by oil lamp inside a room still smelling faintly of smoke damage. His handwriting remains beautiful despite trembling hands. Outside, Mongol guards laugh beside tethered horses while rain taps steadily against roof tiles overhead. Life continues awkwardly inside conquered worlds. And somewhere beyond Persia, new horizons are already attracting Mongol attention. Reports arrive describing distant western kingdoms divided politically and unfamiliar with steppe warfare. Forests thicker than anything in Mongolia, rivers broad as inland seas. Subutai and Jebi continue scouting westward through the Caucasus and beyond, testing defences almost curiously. The empire is learning the shape of Eurasia through movement and violence. Back in the heartlands, Genghis Khan consolidates power further. Laws expand, succession questions begin quietly troubling the royal family. Sons compete subtly for influence beneath outward unity, because even successful empires carry tension inside them from the beginning. You feel that tension now during quieter moments around command fires. Conversations pause when certain princes approach. Advisors choose words carefully. Old uncertainties regarding lineage and inheritance remain unresolved, especially concerning Jochi, Genghis Khan's eldest son. The shadow surrounding his birth still lingers painfully after Borta's earlier captivity. Families remain complicated even while conquering continents, and beneath another darkening sky with smoke fading slowly over ruined Persian cities, the Mongol Empire keeps expanding toward worlds not yet ready for its arrival. Winter closes around the western campaigns like a tightening fist. Snow gathers along forest edges, rivers harden beneath grey skies, cold air burns inside your lungs with every breath, carrying the smell of pine, wet leather, and distant wood smoke. Far from Mongolia now, the Mongol generals Subutai and Jebe continue riding westward through unfamiliar lands. At first, these campaigns are not meant as full conquest. They are reconnaissance, punishment, experiment. The Mongols want information about the lands beyond Central Asia, and no commanders gather information more effectively than these two men. You travel beside them through the Caucasus Mountains where narrow passes twist between ice-covered cliffs. Horses slip on frozen ground, wind screams through rocky corridors so sharply it drowns conversation. The campaign becomes brutally physical. Entire armies survive through endurance as much as strategy. And still the Mongols adapt, always adapt. When mountain tribes resist, the Mongols negotiate with rivals among them. When local kingdoms form alliances, Subutai studies weaknesses patiently before striking. Some enemies are defeated through battle, others through manipulation. Division becomes another weapon. The Georgian kingdoms fight fiercely against the invaders, and at first many local rulers underestimate the strange eastern riders appearing beyond the mountains. That confidence fades quickly. The Mongols move unpredictably across terrain outsiders assume impossible for large mounted forces. They attack, disappear, return from another direction entirely. To medieval observers, it must sometimes feel supernatural. But the reality is colder than myth. The Mongols succeed because they plan carefully, communicate efficiently, and maintain extraordinary discipline under terrible conditions. You stand one freezing morning beside exhausted horses steaming in the cold while Mongol scouts report enemy movements around a distant ridge. Men wrap stiff fingers around cups of hot broth. Saddles crack from frost overnight. No part of this campaign feels comfortable. Yet the westward momentum continues. Jeb and Subutai eventually move north toward the Great Steppe regions beyond the Black Sea, entering worlds inhabited by Turkic nomads, Slavic principalities, and fragmented political alliances. The cultural landscape shifts again. Wooden churches replace mosques in certain settlements. Thick forests crowd the horizon. Villages huddle close beside frozen rivers beneath low clouds. Bells ring faintly through winter fog. To Mongol riders raised beneath endless open grasslands, these northern territories must feel strangely enclosed. And damp. Always damp. The Mongols clash first with the Cumans, a nomadic Turkic people sharing certain cultural similarities with steppe traditions. Defeated Cuman leaders flee westward seeking protection from the Rus princes. This decision pulls Eastern Europe into direct conflict with the Mongols. At first, the Rus princes struggle even to understand what threatens them. Reports arriving from the east sound confused and contradictory. Strange horsemen, cities destroyed far away, armies appearing unexpectedly then vanishing. Some leaders dismiss the danger. Others argue desperately for cooperation. But medieval politics rarely reward unity for long. The Rus principalities remain fragmented by rivalries, suspicion, and competing ambitions. Princes distrust one another almost as much as they distrust the invaders. Subutai notices immediately, and he exploits it. In 1223, the opposing forces meet near the Kalka River. The atmosphere before battle feels tense and uncertain beneath wide spring skies. Mud clings heavily to boots and wagon wheels after rain. Allied Rus and Cuman forces gather in impressive numbers, but coordination remains weak. Different commanders argue over strategy. Messages arrive late or misunderstood. Meanwhile, the Mongols remain calm, patient. You watch Subutai preparing the battlefield almost like a craftsman arranging tools carefully before work begins. Scouts move constantly so communication lines stay organized. Feigned retreats are planned in advance. The battle unfolds disastrously for the Rus coalition. The Mongols lure pursuing forces into disorder, stretching enemy formations apart across difficult terrain. Then they strike decisively. Confusion spreads fast. Horsemen wheel suddenly through dust and shouting. Units lose contact with one another. Retreat routes collapse into chaos beside the riverbanks. And once panic begins, medieval armies often disintegrate quickly. You hear screams carried across open ground while riders crash through shallow water trying desperately to escape. Broken wagons clog muddy slopes. Arrows fall in sudden waves from riders who seem impossible to catch. The defeat becomes catastrophic. Several Rus princes are captured afterward. According to later accounts, Mongol commanders execute them beneath wooden platforms during a victory feast, crushing them slowly beneath the weight while eating above them. Historians debate details, but the symbolism remains chilling. Power displayed deliberately, mercy withheld publicly. For Eastern Europe, the battle is deeply unsettling, even though the Mongols soon withdraw temporarily afterward. Many local rulers still fail to grasp the scale of the threat. The invaders seem terrifying but distant, perhaps another passing steppe force that will eventually disappear. They do not yet understand this is only the beginning. Jeb himself dies sometime after these campaigns, likely during the long return eastward. Details remain uncertain. One of history's great military commanders simply fades from surviving records beneath the enormous movement of events around him. There is something strangely lonely about that. So many lives vanish quietly inside empire. Subutai survives and carries immense experience back toward Mongolia. He has crossed continents gathering intelligence about lands most Mongols had never imagined. Forests, kingdom, river system, political divisions, all of it stored carefully in memory for future campaigns. Because future campaigns are already coming. Back east, Genghis Khan continues consolidating control over Central Asia while preparing new operations elsewhere. Yet age is beginning to touch him visibly now. The great conqueror is no longer young. Long years of campaigning leave marks even on extraordinary men. Exhaustion settles deeper into the body. Old injuries stiffen during cold mornings. Family tensions grow harder to manage, and questions about succession become increasingly dangerous. You sit beside a late-night fire outside the imperial camp while distant horses shift restlessly in darkness. The air smells of smoke and approaching rain. Somewhere nearby, advisors speak in lowered voices about inheritance and loyalties. The empire stretches farther each year, but the man holding it together cannot live forever. The air feels thinner in the final years. Not only because the campaigns climb into higher, harsher landscapes, though they do, something else changes too. Fatigue settles quietly over the empire like dust after a long ride. Genghis Khan is aging. The transformation happens gradually enough that many around him likely barely notice at first. He still rides, still commands armies, still inspires fear across continents. But time moves even through empires. You travel now with the Mongol campaigns against the Tangut kingdom of Western Tyr in northwestern China. The region feels dry and severe beneath pale skies. Wind sweeps across rocky valleys carrying grit against exposed skin. Fortified towns cling stubbornly to trade routes threading through deserts and mountains. The Tanguts had once submitted to Mongol authority. Now relations deteriorate badly. Accounts differ on the exact political causes, but rebellion or insufficient support during earlier campaigns seems to have enraged Genghis Khan deeply. The aging conqueror launches another punitive expedition with characteristic determination and characteristic brutality. Cities resisting Mongol forces face destruction once again. The pattern has become grimly familiar across Eurasia now. Surrender early and perhaps survive, resist and risk catastrophe. Yet even after decades of conquest, warfare still feels physically miserable up close. You wake before dawn inside the imperial camp. Frost stiffens saddle leather. Men cough beside weak fires while cooks scrape ice from water buckets. Horses stamp impatiently against frozen ground. No one looks rested anymore. The empire has expanded astonishingly fast, but expansion demands constant motion. Endless campaigns, endless logistics, endless negotiation between powerful commanders and ambitious princes. Genghis Khan carries all of this constantly. There are moments during these final years when surviving sources describe him withdrawing into reflection more often, asking questions about immortality, consulting religious figures and healers, seeking wisdom from Taoist monks reputed to understand longevity. That longing feels painfully human. A man who reshaped the world still cannot escape death. One famous encounter involves the Taoist monk Q Chuji, invited to meet Genghis Khan during earlier campaigns. Their conversations reportedly touch on governance, moderation, spirituality, and the impossibility of physical immortality. Imagine the scene, the conqueror seated inside a campaign tent smelling faintly of smoke and horsehair while an elderly monk speaks calmly about mortality. Outside, guards stand silently beneath enormous night skies, power and impermanence sharing the same space. Meanwhile, tensions inside the imperial family continue sharpening beneath outward unity. Genghis Khan's sons are capable men, but rivalry shadows their relationships constantly. Jokshi, the eldest, remains emotionally distant from his father at times. The uncertainty surrounding his birth after Borta's kidnapping never fully disappears politically, regardless of Genghis Khan's public acceptance of him. Chagatai openly questions Joki's legitimacy during disputes. Ogedei, calmer and more diplomatic, increasingly appears positioned as compromise heir. Tolui, the youngest, remains deeply trusted militarily. The family dinners must feel unbearable sometimes. You imagine tense silences during evening meals, servants moving carefully between seated princes, cups refilled quietly while political calculations flicker behind controlled expressions. Empires often fracture first emotionally before they fracture geographically, and Genghis Khan knows this. At some point during the Western Xia campaign, his health worsened seriously. The exact cause remains uncertain. Historians debate possibilities endlessly. Perhaps injuries from a fall during hunting. Perhaps illness. Perhaps accumulated exhaustion from decades of relentless warfare. No clear agreement survives. What matters emotionally is simpler. The man who once survived starvation on the steppe is dying far from the childhood world that shaped him. You sit outside the imperial encampment during those final weeks. Summer storms gather heavily across distant hills. Rain taps softly against felt tents through the night while guards whisper uncertain rumours between patrols. Inside, advisors move quietly. Messengers arrive constantly. Nobody speaks openly about death yet, but everyone feels its presence. There is something strangely intimate about the end of enormous historical figures. The maps and victories fade briefly into the background. Suddenly, practical human details matter again. Difficulty sleeping, pain, exhaustion, the sound of breathing in dark rooms. Some accounts suggest Genghis Khan orders secrecy surrounding his condition to maintain military stability. Whether entirely true or partly legend, the idea fits the empire he built. Appear weak too publicly and uncertainty spreads quickly, especially across such vast territory. Eventually, in 1227, Genghis Khan dies. The exact location remains uncertain. Somewhere during the Western Xia campaign, he's likely in his 60s, though medieval records remain imprecise. Grand final speech survives reliably. No dramatic farewell, just absence afterward. And the silence must have felt enormous. For decades his presence shaped nearly every major decision inside the Mongol world. Generals, princes, diplomats, merchants, conquered peoples, everyone measured themselves partly against his will. Now suddenly that certainty disappears. The secrecy surrounding his burial becomes legendary. According to later traditions, the funeral procession kills witnesses along its route to preserve the grave's location. Stories grow increasingly dramatic over centuries. Historians debate many details, yet the mystery itself feels appropriate somehow. The boy abandoned on the steppe leaves behind no confirmed tomb. Only an empire stretching across continents. After his death, the Mongols temporarily conceal the news while military operations continue. Western Xia is crushed completely. Some accounts describe horrifying destruction inflicted upon the kingdom afterward, perhaps intensified by grief and vengeance. Then the long process of succession begins. And succession inside empires is never calm. You ride eastward now through exhausted landscapes shaped by years of warfare. Rivers reflecting grey autumn skies, burned fortresses standing empty beside caravan roads, slowly filling again with cautious trade. Everywhere people try adjusting to the world Genghis Khan created, a world simultaneously more connected and more terrified than before. His chosen successor, Ogedei, will inherit immense possibilities along with immense instability. New campaigns already wait beyond the horizon. Europe remains vulnerable, the Middle East still trembles, China remains unconquered fully. The empire is nowhere near finished expanding, but something fundamental has ended. The first generation of Mongol conquest closes here beside fading campaign fires and the quiet grief of men too exhausted even to speak loudly. After Genghis Khan dies, the empire holds its breath. Not literally. Of course, horses still need feeding, armies still march, traders still haggle over silver and silk beneath crowded market awnings. Somewhere a child still wakes crying in the middle of the night while rain taps softly against felt walls. But politically, emotionally so, something pauses. The man who held the Mongol world together through force of personality, fear, intelligence, and relentless movement is gone. His sons and generals inherit a realm stretching farther than any of them had imagined during the hungry tribal wars of earlier decades. And now they must decide what comes next. You travel eastward as toward the great Kurultai convened to determine succession formally. Riders cross enormous distances carrying messages between scattered territories. Dust rises endlessly along the roads. Camps swell with nobles, officers, servants, interpreters, merchants, and armed escorts. The atmosphere feels cautious. Too much depends on this moment. Genghis Khan had named Ogedei as his preferred successor before death, likely because Ogedei possessed a calmer temperament than his brothers. He is considered diplomatic, steady, less personally divisive. Not weak. Just easier to unite behind. That distinction matters enormously. The Kurultai eventually confirms him as Great Khan in 1229. Ceremony unfolds beneath open sky, according to steppe tradition. though the empire now includes people from civilizations built around palaces, temples, libraries, and bureaucracies unimaginable to earlier Mongol tribes. The contrast feels strange. Nomadic traditions now govern an empire of cities. You stand among the gathering crowds while banners snap sharply in cold wind. Horses crowd the hillsides in astonishing numbers. Nobles wear heavy silk beside rough leather. Interpreters murmur translations constantly between Mongolian, Turkic, Persian, and Chinese speakers. The empire has become multilingual almost accidentally. Ogde steps into power carrying enormous expectations. At first, he governs effectively. This surprises some historians because later accounts sometimes portray him as overly fond of drinking and luxury. Those tendencies likely existed, but reducing him to them misses the larger reality. Under Ogedei, the Mongol Empire continues expanding with remarkable coordination. Administrative systems strengthen. Trade routes stabilize further. Communication networks improve dramatically. The famous YAM system, a relay network of stations across the empire, expands during these years. Riders carrying official messages can travel astonishing distances quickly by changing horses at designated posts. You imagine one of these stations at dusk beside an isolated road. Lanterns glowing warmly against darkness. Stable hands rushing forward as exhausted messengers arrive, coated in mud and windblown dust. Fresh horses waiting already. The empire moves through information now as much as cavalry. Ogedei also supports building projects and administration in ways reflecting the empire's changing identity. The Mongols remain deeply tied to steppe traditions, yet governing vast settled populations requires new approaches. Cities matter now. Taxation matters. Paper records matter. This transformation creates tension inside Mongol culture itself. Some traditionalists fear luxury and urban influence weakening older warrior values. Others recognize the empire cannot survive permanently through conquest alone. You feel this cultural shift vividly in Karakoram, the emerging Mongol capital. The city is still rough compared to ancient urban centres elsewhere, but remarkably cosmopolitan. Merchants from many lands arrive with goods and stories. Craftsmen from conquered territories work beside Mongol elites. The smell of horse dung mixes with incense and unfamiliar cooking spices. Nothing about the empire feels culturally pure anymore. And still the conquests continue. Ogedei authorizes major campaigns in multiple directions simultaneously. In the east, Mongol pressure against the Jin dynasty intensifies further. In the west, plans emerge for a full-scale invasion of Europe based partly on intelligence gathered years earlier by Subutai. Subutai himself remains central to these efforts. Older now, immensely experienced, still methodical, he prepares the western campaigns with frightening thoroughness. Routes are mapped carefully, supply arrangements coordinated, enemy political divisions studied in detail. The Mongols do not simply charge blindly into Europe. They investigate first. Meanwhile, ordinary people across the empire experience Mongol rule differently depending on location and circumstance. Some regions suffer heavily under taxation or military occupation. Others benefit unexpectedly from increased trade security. A merchant travelling from China toward Persia may now cross enormous distances under relatively stable imperial protection. This period later becomes known as part of the Pax Mongolica, though peace under empire always depends partly on the memory of violence. You ride with a caravan moving west through Central Asia during these years. Camels groan beneath heavy loads. Guards scan horizons carefully despite improved security. Travellers exchange stories around evening fires beneath stars startlingly bright over the desert. A Persian doctor discusses the medicine with a Chinese trader. A Mongol officer asks questions about distant European kingdoms. Cultures meet constantly now because conquest has forced them together. Not all encounters are peaceful, yet exchange deepens regardless. At the same time, the empire's sheer size creates enormous logistical and emotional strain. Communication improves, but governing territories stretching across Eurasia remains incredibly difficult. Local governors grow powerful. Princes compete quietly for influence. Different regions evolve distinct political cultures. The seeds of future fragmentation already exist beneath the surface. Still, during the 1230s, momentum remains overwhelmingly with the Mongols. The Jin dynasty weakens steadily under coordinated pressure. Siege warfare technologies improve further through collaboration with Chinese and Persian engineers. Cities once considered nearly impregnable fall after sustained campaigns. You stand outside one besieged northern Chinese fortress during freezing rain. Mud swallows boots with every step. Engineers labour beside massive siege machines wrapped in wet hides against fire arrows. War has become increasingly technical, not less brutal, more organised. Meanwhile, in Europe, few rulers truly understand the danger approaching from the east. Reports about the Mongols still sound distant and confusing. Some believe them exaggerated myths, others imagine another temporary nomadic raid that will fade eventually. They do not realise the Empire now views Europe strategically, systematically. And somewhere inside a warm command tent smelling faintly of ink and damp wool, Subutai studies maps beneath candlelight, preparing the next great expansion of Mongol power. Snow falls softly over the forests of Rus. It gathers along pine branches, muffles wagon wheels, softens rooftops beneath pale winter light. Smoke rises from wooden villages into cold grey skies while church bells ring somewhere beyond frozen rivers. At first glance, the world feels calm. Then the riders arrive. By the late 1230s, the Mongol Empire turns its full attention westward under the leadership of Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, and the veteran general Subutai. Their objective is not merely raiding anymore, it is domination. The Rus principalities stand divided politically despite shared religion and culture. Rival princes compete constantly for influence. Alliances shift uneasily, cities guard their own interests first. Subutai understands this immediately. Fragmentation remains the Mongols' favourite enemy. You travel now beside the advancing armies through brutal winter conditions. Horses breathe steam into freezing air. Leather stiffens overnight with frost. Rivers become roads once ice thickens enough beneath iron-shod hooves. The Mongols move with terrifying discipline despite the cold. Entire settlements vanish behind them. The first major target is Ryazan in 1237. Messengers reportedly plead desperately for aid from neighbouring princes, but coordinated support arrives too slowly. Political distrust weakens every response. The city stands largely alone. You wait outside the walls beneath falling snow while siege engines creak forward through mud and ice. Inside the city, families gather inside churches lit by trembling candlelight. Priests pray aloud while exhausted defenders sharpen weapons already worn from earlier fighting. Everyone understands what Mongol conquest has meant to elsewhere. The fear is immediate. When Ryazan falls, destruction follows. Chronicles written later describe terrible slaughter, though medieval accounts often heighten emotional intensity dramatically. Still, archaeological evidence confirms widespread devastation across many Rus cities during these campaigns. The Mongols move from one principality to another with relentless speed. Moscow exists at this time only as a small settlement and suffers early in the invasion. Vladimir, once among the most important Rus cities, falls after fierce resistance. Smoke darkens winter skies above shattered walls. You walk afterward through streets filled with burned timber and frozen debris. Snow covers bodies partially beside collapsed homes. Survivors move numbly between ruins carrying whatever belongings remain intact. The silence feels heavier in cold weather somehow. And yet daily life keeps insisting on itself even here. A woman melts snow over a weak fire beside a damaged church. A child searches carefully through ash for missing wooden toys. An old man repairs harness straps because horses still require feeding tomorrow. History continues through ordinary tasks. Meanwhile, the Mongol armies remain astonishingly coordinated across vast distances, Subutai directs campaigns strategically, while Batu Khan provides political leadership. Communication between units functions efficiently despite forests, rivers, and brutal weather. European observers struggle to comprehend it. Many expect nomadic armies to weaken during winter. Instead, the Mongols use winter aggressively. Frozen terrain actually helps movement in many regions. Rivers become highways, swamps harden enough for cavalry passage. Defenders accustomed to seasonal pauses in warfare suddenly face attacks through conditions they considered protective. Adaptability becomes psychological warfare again. You spend one bitter night inside a Mongol encampment beside the Volga River. Wind rattles tent walls relentlessly. Horses huddle together against the cold while guards pace through darkness wrapped in heavy furs. The camp smells of smoke, wet wool, and boiled meat. No one speaks much. Campaign exhaustion hangs over everything now. Many soldiers have spent years far from Mongolia, moving through unfamiliar landscapes and endless warfare. Still, momentum carries them onward. Some Rus princes attempt resistance bravely. Others negotiate submission when defeat appears inevitable. The outcomes vary, but the broader pattern remains clear. The Mongols are reshaping Eastern Europe permanently. One particularly haunting moment occurs during the sack of Kozelsk, a small town resisting fiercely despite terrible odds. Mongol sources themselves reportedly describe frustration at the stubborn defence. The city eventually falls after prolonged struggle. Accounts afterwards speak of devastating retaliation. Even small acts of resistance can provoke enormous violence within imperial conquest. Yet the Rus world does not disappear entirely under Mongol rule. That distinction matters. Unlike certain conquered regions elsewhere, many Rus principalities survive as tributary states beneath Mongol dominance rather than being fully absorbed administratively. Local princes continue governing, though now under the authority of the Golden Horde, the Western Mongol Khanate emerging under Batu. Tribute flows eastward. Political legitimacy increasingly depends on Mongol approval, and psychologically the balance of power changes completely. You visit a Rus princely court years later after the initial invasions. The atmosphere feels subdued. Fur cloaks dry beside indoor fires while scribes copy tax records carefully under candlelight. Outside, snow falls again across dark forests. Conversation keeps returning toward the horde. Who has favour there? Which prince received recognition? What tribute demands might increase next year? Mongol authority becomes woven into daily political life. For ordinary people, the experience remains complicated. Taxes can feel crushing. Raids and military demands continue. Fear never disappears entirely. Yet trade routes reopen gradually under Mongol stability. Some cities recover economically. Cultural exchange deepens unexpectedly across Eurasia through these imperial connections. Conquest and integration exist side by side again. And farther west, Europe still fails to grasp the scale of the threat fully. The Mongols continue advancing into Poland and Hungary during the early 1240s, defeating armies repeatedly through superior coordination and battlefield tactics. News spreads chaotically through monasteries and royal courts. Eastern cities burn. Refugees flee westward. Rumours exist and grow stranger with every retelling. Some Europeans believe the invaders might be biblical punishments. Others imagine monstrous eastern tribes from medieval legends. Fear distorts understanding quickly. Then suddenly, almost unbelievably, the Mongol advance pauses. Genghis Khan dies back in Mongolia in 1241, creating political necessity for senior leaders to return eastward for succession matters. Campaigns into deeper Europe slow dramatically. The continent receives an unexpected reprieve, not through military victory, through imperial politics thousands of miles away. You stand at the edge of a ruined village watching smoke fade slowly into cold evening air, while exhausted survivors emerge cautiously from forest shelters. The Mongols have passed through like a storm, but the memory of them will remain for generations. Baghdad still believes itself eternal. Even after centuries of political decline, even after rival dynasties rise and fall across the Islamic world, The city carries the memory of greatness like perfume lingering in old fabric. Scholars still gather beside libraries. Merchants still crowd the markets. The Tigris still moves steadily beneath stone bridges reflecting sunlight. You arrive there in the middle of the 13th century and feel history pressing from every direction. The Abbasid Caliphate no longer controls an empire matching its former glory, but Baghdad remains symbolically immense. For many Muslims, the Caliph still represents spiritual continuity stretching back generations. The city feels ancient and alive at once. Paper sellers shout prices beside narrow streets heavy with spice and marmouk. Water carriers move through crowded alleys ringing small bells. At night, oil lamps flicker across courtyards while scholars debate theology beneath carved wooden ceilings. People continue ordinary life because ordinary life usually continues, until it suddenly cannot. Far to the east, the Mongol Empire has changed again since the days of Genghis Khan. The once unified realm now operates increasingly through separate khanates governed by descendants competing for influence while still claiming shared imperial heritage. One of those descendants is Kublai Khan, brother of the great Khan Mongol, grandson of Genghis Khan, and now commander of a massive western campaign. His mission is partly strategic, partly political. The Mongols want to secure western territories permanently, destroy hostile powers, and extend authority deeper into the Middle East. Resistance from regional states and fortified sectarian strongholds continues frustrating imperial ambitions. So Hulagu advances westward with overwhelming force. The army accompanying him is enormous by medieval standards, reinforced with engineers, siege specialists, administrators, and troops drawn from many conquered peoples. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and steppe nomads all move together beneath Mongol command. Empires blur identities strangely. You ride with the advancing forces through landscapes already trembling with fear. Villages empty ahead of the army. Refugees crowd roads carrying blankets, grain sacks, holy texts, exhausted children. Rumours spread faster than certainty, and the rumours are terrible. The Mongols have already destroyed several major powers. They have erased cities thought secure behind massive walls. Their reputation travels ahead of them like smoke before wildfire. Some rulers submit immediately. Others hesitate. Baghdad hesitates. Historians still debate exactly why the Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim misjudges the danger so badly. Perhaps court politics cloud his judgment. Perhaps advisors offer false confidence. Perhaps the scale of Mongol power simply feels unimaginable from within palace walls. Whatever the cause, diplomacy fails, and by 1258 the Mongol army surrounds Baghdad. The atmosphere inside the city turns heavy with dread. You walk crowded streets where merchants hurriedly close shops before sunset. Families store food nervously inside dark cellars. Mosque courtyards fill with whispered conversations and frightened prayers. Outside the walls, Mongol siege preparations unfold methodically. Not chaotically. That detail matters. The Mongols approach warfare like engineers now as much as horsemen. Chinese and Persian siege experts construct massive machines. Supply lines are organized carefully. Defensive weaknesses studied systematically. Baghdad has faced sieges before, but not like this. The bombardment begins. Stone projectiles crash into towers. Fire spreads through outer districts. Panic ripples unevenly through the population as defenders struggle to respond effectively. You hear the constant rhythm of siege warfare day and night now. Wood splintering, orders shouted through smoke, horses screaming in confusion somewhere beyond the walls. Sleep becomes impossible. The city falls quickly compared to its symbolic importance. Then comes the destruction. Few events in medieval history acquire such lasting emotional weight. Contemporary accounts describe widespread killing, looting and devastation after the Mongol capture. Medieval chroniclers may exaggerate certain details dramatically, especially regarding numbers, but no serious historian doubts the catastrophe itself. Baghdad is shattered. Libraries burn. Mosques are damaged. Neighborhoods collapse into chaos. One famous story claims the Tigris River ran black with ink from destroyed books and red with blood from the dead. Historians question the literal truth of such descriptions, yet emotionally the image endured because it captured what people felt had been lost, not merely a city's. A civilization's confidence. You move afterward through smoke-filled streets where survivors wander beside collapsed buildings searching for relatives. Ash drifts softly across shattered courtyards. The smell is unbearable in places. Burned wood. Rotting food. Death hidden beneath debris. And amid all this devastation, ordinary gestures continue stubbornly. A father carrying water to injured strangers. A woman brushing dust carefully from damaged manuscripts. Children sleeping from exhaustion beside walls still warm from fire. Human tenderness survives even in ruins. The Abbasid Caliph himself is captured. Accounts surrounding his death vary, wrapped partly in legend. One common version claims the Mongols avoided spilling royal blood directly due to steppe beliefs, instead executing him through suffocation or trampling within carpets. No clear certainty survives. Only the symbolic reality. The Abbasid era effectively ends here. For the Islamic world, the emotional shock is profound. Baghdad had represented intellectual and spiritual continuity for centuries. Its fall reverberates across regions far beyond Iraq itself. Yet history keeps moving even through grief. Under Mongol rule, parts of the Middle East eventually stabilize again. Trade resumes gradually. Administrators reorganize governance. Some Mongol elites convert to Islam over time, reshaping cultural dynamics within the Western Khanates. Conquest transforms conquerors too. You sit one evening beside the Tigris months after the siege. The river moves quietly through fading sunset while workers rebuild damaged structures nearby. Hammering echoes softly through cooling air. The city is wounded terribly, but not dead. No city that old dies easily. And elsewhere across the empire, deeper fractures are beginning to appear. Communication between Mongol branches weakens. Succession disputes intensify after the death of Great Khan Monka. Unity grows thinner now. The empire still appears unstoppable from outside. Inside, however, rival ambitions are gathering like distant thunder. The sea wind smells different from the steppe. Salt hangs heavily in the air around southern China, mixing with river mud, cooking fires, wet wood, and crowded humanity. Boats clog the waterways in astonishing numbers. Market streets overflow with silk merchants, tea sellers, scholars, labourers, monks, musicians. To Mongol eyes raised beneath open grasslands, the world of Song China must seem impossibly dense. Too many walls. Too many. People, too much water everywhere. And yet by the middle of the 13th century, this is where the future of the empire increasingly points. Kublai Khan understands that more clearly than many of his relatives. Grandson of Genghis Khan, brother of Mongol, a skilled commander but also something more complicated. Curious, politically flexible, deeply interested in Chinese administration and culture in ways some traditional Mongol elites find unsettling. You first encounter him in the northern China during years of transition and tension. He moves through military camps confidently, but he also spends time with scholars, Buddhist advisors, engineers, and administrators. He asks questions constantly, not only about warfare, about taxes, agriculture, governance, how to rule settled civilizations rather than merely conquer them. This difference matters enormously. Because the Mongol Empire is changing again. The generation that grew up amid desperate tribal wars is fading. Their descendants inherit sprawling territories filled mostly with non-Mongol populations. Governing such lands requires adaptation beyond cavalry tactics and terror campaigns. Kublai recognizes this. Some relatives distrust him for it. especially as succession struggles intensify after Mongol Khan dies in 1259 during campaigns against the southern Song dynasty. Competing branches of the imperial family maneuver aggressively for power. The dream of unified empire weakens further. Civil war nearly erupts openly between Kublai and his brother Arik Bok. You feel the tensions spreading through Mongol political circles during these years. Messengers ride urgently between camps. Loyalists declare support carefully. Banquets become dangerous spaces where every conversation carries hidden implications. Even family gatherings feel strategic now. Kublai eventually prevails after years of political and military struggle, securing recognition as Great Khan, yet his authority remains incomplete. Several Western Mongol Khanates operate increasingly independently. The empire still exists, but unity is becoming symbolic more than practical. Meanwhile, Kublai focuses intensely on China. The southern Song dynasty remains one of the richest and most sophisticated states in the world, protected by enormous cities, advanced naval forces, and powerful economic systems. Conquering it fully proves far harder than earlier Mongol victories over northern kingdoms. The campaigns drag on for years. Siege stretch endlessly through humid landscapes where rain soaks clothing for days at a time. Rivers complicate cavalry movement. Disease spreads more easily in southern climates unfamiliar to many steppe soldiers. You stand beside a Mongol encampment during monsoon weather, while water drips steadily from tent edges into thick mud below. Mosquitoes swarm near stagnant pools. Horses weaken in the humidity. The empire feels uncomfortable here. Yet again, the Mongols adapt. They build naval forces using Chinese and Korean expertise. Siege technologies improve further. Administrative systems deepen. Gradually, painfully, the Song resistance weakens beneath sustained pressure. And throughout these years, Kublai increasingly embraces the role of Chinese-style emperor rather than purely nomadic Khan. He establishes a new dynasty, the Yuan. The symbolism matters enormously. You enter Kublai's court and immediately sense the transformation underway. Chinese architectural styles influence palace design. Bureaucrats organize records meticulously. Court ceremonies blend Mongol traditions with imperial Chinese ritual. Silk rustles softly across the polished floors, while incense drifts through large halls lit by filtered afternoon sunlight. This is no longer simply a steppe empire. It is becoming something hybrid, complex, contradictory. Traditional Mongol elites sometimes resent these changes deeply. They fear cultural dilution, softness, loss of ancestral identity. Some believe Kublai spends too much time among scholars and urban luxuries. Perhaps they are partly right, but Kublai also understands political reality better than many critics. The Mongols remain a small minority ruling vast settled populations. Long-term control requires cooperation with existing administrative systems. Pure conquest cannot sustain empire forever. Still, tension lingers everywhere beneath the surface. Chinese subjects often resent Mongol rule despite periods of stability and economic recovery. Ethnic hierarchies place Mongols above many local populations politically. Tax burdens can feel severe. Corruption spreads through certain bureaucratic structures. Empire creates resentment as naturally as authority. And yet the Yuan court also becomes one of the most cosmopolitan centers on Earth. Travelers arrive from Persia, Central Asia, Korea, Russia, even Europe. Merchants exchange goods from astonishing distances. Religious communities coexist uneasily beneath imperial protection. You wander through Khanbaliq, modern Beijing. During Kublai's reign, the city pulses with movement. Camel caravans enter through crowded gates while officials carrying documents hurry between government buildings. The smells change constantly, street by street. Roasted meat, river water, horse dung, tea leaves drying in warm air, paper ink. Human civilization compressed densely together. Among the foreign visitors eventually arriving is a Venetian merchant family. including a young man later known as Marco Polo. Historians still debate portions of his later accounts, but broader cultural exchange between East and West unquestionably deepens during this era. The Mongol Empire has connected Eurasia in unprecedented ways, not peacefully, but effectively, and Kublai himself grows older, surrounded increasingly by luxury, responsibility, and personal grief. Several loved ones die during his reign, including his favoured wife Chabi. The emotional losses seem to affect him deeply. He eats more heavily, drinks more, withdraws at times into melancholy. Even emperors ruling enormous realms remain vulnerable to loneliness. By the time the Southern Song dynasty finally collapses completely in 1279, Mongol rule over China is formally secure. The conquest has taken decades. Millions have suffered through warfare, famine, displacement, and political upheaval. And now, at last, the descendants of horsemen from the steppe sit upon the Chinese imperial throne. Though somewhere beneath the palace silks and ceremonial grandeur, the old winds of Mongolia still whisper faintly through memory. The roads feel safer now. Not perfectly safe, never that. A traveller crossing Eurasia in the 13th century still risks storms, bandits, disease, political intrigue, broken wheels, exhausted animals, and simple bad luck beneath indifferent skies. But compared to earlier generations, movement becomes astonishingly easier across much of the Mongol world. For a while, at least. Historians later call this period the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. Though the phrase hides uncomfortable contradictions, the peace exists partly because entire regions remember what resistance once cost. Still, stability grows from conquest in strange ways. You travel westwards with a merchant caravan leaving northern China beneath clear autumn skies. Bells tied to camel harnesses ring softly with each step. Guards ride alongside bundled in wool against rising wind while traders argue gently over prices and routes. The caravan includes many languages: Mongolian, Persian, Turkic dialects, Chinese, even fragments of Latin spoken awkwardly by European travellers hoping profit waits somewhere farther east. Empires connect people who might otherwise never imagine one another. The Mongol rulers understand trade instinctively because trade strengthens political control. Caravans carry taxes, information, technology, diplomatic messages, and cultural influence alongside luxury goods. So roads receive protection. Relay stations supply fresh horses. Banditry is punished harshly, and gradually merchants begin trusting the routes again. You stop one evening at a caravanserai in Central Asia, a fortified roadside inn crowded with travellers escaping the cold night wind. Lantern light flickers across tired faces, while cooks prepare steaming bowls of soup thick with onions and lamb fat. The smell alone feels comforting after weeks on dusty roads. Nearby, a Persian astronomer argues politely with a Chinese scholar about calendars and eclipses. A Nestorian Christian priest speaks quietly with Muslim traders from Samarkand. Mongol officials inspect travel documents while scribes copy records onto paper smudged with ink. The world feels interconnected here in ways earlier centuries rarely achieved. Ideas travel alongside silk and sogi. Gunpowder knowledge moves westward. Gradually, mathematical concepts circulate between civilizations. Medical practices spread through translated texts and wandering physicians. The Mongol Empire becomes a giant corridor across Eurasia. It's not peaceful everywhere, but connected. You meet artisans relocated forcibly from conquered cities now working far from their birthplaces. A Persian metalworker crafting decorative pieces in China. Chinese engineers advising irrigation projects in Central Asia. Many never chose these journeys. Yet cultural exchange deepens regardless. The empire creates movement constantly. Some movement voluntary, some deeply tragic. At sea, maritime trade expands too. Ports along the Indian Ocean grow busier as merchants operate beneath broader imperial stability. Spices, ceramics, ivory, textiles, and precious stones flow between distant markets. You stand at a harbour watching sailors unload cargo beside noisy docks crowded with interpreters, labourers, tax collectors, and stray animals searching for scraps. Salt air mixes with fish, wet rope, sweat, and tar. Everything smells alive, and everywhere information moves faster than before. A ruler in Persia may hear news from China within months rather than years. Travellers carry stories about unfamiliar customs, technologies, religions, and political systems across astonishing distances. Some accounts become wildly distorted during retelling. Others reshape entire societies gradually. The Mongols themselves absorb influences continuously now. Elite families in different khanates adopt local languages, religions, and administrative traditions. In Persia, Mongol rulers increasingly convert to Islam. In China, Yuan emperors embrace aspects of Chinese statecraft. The empire remains Mongol politically. Culturally, it grows more blended each generation, and that blending creates unease too. Traditional steppe identities weaken over time. Some Mongol nobles complain younger generations prefer luxury over hardship. Court life softens old military discipline in certain regions. You hear these complaints often during evenings around aristocratic gatherings. Older warriors stare into their cups, remembering earlier campaigns while musicians play softly nearby, inside warm halls scented with wine and incense. Memory becomes political, especially inside empires built by conquest. Meanwhile, ordinary people continue adapting pragmatically to changing realities. Farmers care more about taxes and harvests than imperial ideology. Shopkeepers reopen businesses wherever stability allows. Religious communities negotiate protections under shifting rulers. Life narrows naturally towards survival and family. Even while enormous historical transformations unfold overhead, one traveller moving across these routes during the later 13th century describes seeing goods from distant lands stacked together in market districts almost unimaginably far from their origins. Russian furs beside Chinese porcelain, Persian carpets beside Korean metalwork, African ivory beside Mongolian leather. The medieval world feels wider and smaller simultaneously, and yet beneath all this exchange lurks vulnerability. Trade routes carry more than wealth. They carry disease too. For now, few people recognize that danger clearly. You continue westward through the empire under skies changing gradually from dry blue steppe light to softer European cloud cover. Roads remain busy, tax stations operate efficiently. Merchants complain about fees while quietly appreciating the relative security. The Mongol system works remarkably well at its height. That truth matters even alongside the violence that created it. There are nights when travellers gather around roadside fires exchanging stories from opposite ends of Eurasia. Someone describes monsoon rains in southern China. Another speaks about frozen Russian rivers. A Venetian merchant gestures dramatically while discussing Mediterranean ports crowded with ships. People laugh despite exhaustion. For a brief moment, the empire feels almost hopeful. A connected world? A shared horizon stretching across continents. But connection always carries consequences nobody fully predicts. And quietly, almost invisibly, deeper fractures continue spreading through the Mongol realms. Rival khanates compete economically and politically. Succession disputes weaken central authority further. Distance strains communication despite improved infrastructure. The empire remains enormous, perhaps too enormous. You feel that weight now while watching a messenger ride hard into darkness carrying sealed orders towards some distant frontier few people in the West have ever seen. Even the fastest horse cannot outrun geography forever. Distance begins ruining things quietly, not dramatically at first. No single battle shatters the Mongol Empire overnight. No sudden collapse sends the whole structure tumbling into dust beneath one terrible afternoon sky. Instead, strain spreads slowly through roads, courts, and conversations. You feel it while travelling between the far edges of the empire during the late 13th century. Messages still move astonishingly fast compared to earlier eras, but the sheer scale of Mongol territory creates unavoidable problems. A command issued in China may take months reaching Persia. A political dispute in Central Asia may already be violent before distant rulers even hear about it. Empires stretching across continents depend heavily on trust, and trust is thinning. You arrive first in the Western Khanates, where descendants of Genghis Khan increasingly govern like independent rulers rather than obedient branches of one unified system. The Golden Horde dominates the Western Steppe and Russian territories. The Ilkhanate controls Persia and surrounding regions. Central Asia fractures beneath competing claims. Each court develops differently. Different languages, different religions, different priorities. The shared Mongol identity remains important symbolically, but daily political reality pulls regions apart. You walk through the Ilkhanate court in Persia, where Mongol nobles now wear flowing robes influenced by Islamic fashion, while Persian bureaucrats manage much of the administration. Arabic and Persian fill government offices more often than Mongolian. Nearby, Islamic scholars debate theology beneath tiled ceilings glowing blue in afternoon sunlight. This hardly resembles the camps of early steppe warriors anymore. And farther east in Yuan China, Kublai Khan's court operates through increasingly elaborate imperial systems inherited partly from earlier Chinese dynasties. Ceremony, taxation, grain shipments, canal maintenance, palace politic, the empire is becoming localized. Adaptation strengthens regional rule while weakening imperial unity. You can sense older Mongol ideals fading gradually beneath comfort and complexity. Young aristocrats raised in palace environments sometimes know little about the brutal survival conditions their grandparents endured on the steppe. Some still romanticize that past. Others quietly prefer silk cushions and heated rooms. Neither instinct fully solves the empire's problems, because geography remains merciless. The farther you travel, the more obvious the fragmentation becomes. Border disputes erupt between khanates. Trade disagreements escalate into military tension. Diplomats speak politely while preparing for conflict behind closed doors. Family rivalries sharpen everything. The descendants of Genghis Khan carry immense prestige, but they also inherit enormous ambition. Every branch believes itself deserving of authority. Every succession dispute risks wider instability. And succession disputes happen constantly. You sit inside a crowded audience hall one winter evening, while advisors argue carefully around a nervous ruler whose claim to power remains contested. Braziers crackle softly against the cold. Servants refill cups of fermented mare's milk while guards watch the room with visible tension. The age of untoppable expansion is ending. That realization spreads unevenly across the empire, but it spreads. Military campaigns continue. Of course, as frontier wars never truly stop. Yet the emotional atmosphere changes. Earlier generations conquered with fierce momentum and terrifying confidence. Now rulers spend increasing energy managing internal problems. Rebellion, corruption, Khanate strain, rival princes, administrative overload. The machinery of empire grows heavier each year. In Yuan China especially, the burden becomes severe. Maintaining control over vast populations requires enormous taxation and complex bureaucracy. Floods, famine, inflation, and political resentment begin destabilizing parts of the dynasty. Many Chinese subjects never fully accept Mongol rule emotionally. Resentment simmers beneath outward obedience. You walk through a crowded southern Chinese town during heavy rain, where local farmers complain quietly about taxes while pretending not to notice nearby officials. Mud clings thickly to sandals. Rice fields stretch beyond the village beneath grey skies. Ordinary people measure empire through practical hardship. Can they eat? Can they pay taxes? Will soldiers arrive this year? Ideology matters less than servile. Meanwhile in Persia, the Ilkhanate faces its own challenges. Mongol rulers increasingly convert to Islam, altering political alliances and cultural identity further. Some traditional Mongol elites resist these changes uneasily. Others embrace them fully. The empire keeps transforming faster than any single identity can contain. And still the roads remain busy. That is the strange part. Even while political unity weakens, the networks built during Mongol expansion continue functioning remarkably well for a time. Merchants still cross Eurasia, diplomats still exchange gifts, travellers still describe distant lands with astonished fascination. You meet an aging merchant in Samarkand who remembers the earlier conquests as a young boy. He speaks while warming thin hands beside a brazier smelling faintly of charcoal and lamb stew. He remembers fear first, then opportunity, now uncertainty again. His voice sounds tired. Perhaps that is what large historical change often feels like to ordinary people. Not triumph or apocalypse, just exhaustion from adapting repeatedly. At the edges of the empire, local powers begin testing Mongol authority more openly. Resistance movements grow bolder in some regions, tributary states negotiate harder. The aura of invincibility fades slowly after military setbacks and political fragmentation. No empire stays terrifying forever. Even memory softens over generations. Yet the Mongols have already reshaped Eurasia permanently by this point. Trade routes, diplomatic connections, military techniques, demographic shifts, cultural exchange. The world cannot fully return to what existed before them. You stand one evening beside the ruins of an old caravan station abandoned after changing trade patterns redirected movement elsewhere. Wind whistles softly through cracked walls beneath fading sunset. Grass grows between stones once crowded with travellers from half the known world. The empire still exists, but you can feel time pulling at its edges now. The sickness arrives quietly. No army escorts it. No banners announce it across the horizon. No ruler fully understands it while it spreads from body to body along the roads and sea routes connecting the Mongol world. At first it is only rumour. A fever in one trading town. A ship arriving with too many dead aboard. Villages where the church bells ring constantly for funerals. People always hear rumours of disease somewhere far away. Most disappear eventually into the ordinary suffering of medieval life. This one does not. You travel westward as during the middle of the 14th century, through trade routes still shaped by the Mongol expansion. Caravan traffic continues despite growing political fragmentation. Merchants move silk, grain, silver, spices, and textiles across continents connected more tightly than ever before, and hidden among all that movement travels plague. Historians still debate certain details of origin and transmission, but the broader reality is devastatingly clear. The disease later known as the Black Death spreads across Eurasia with astonishing speed, aided partly by the very commercial networks the Mongol era strengthened. Connection becomes vulnerability. You first notice the atmosphere changing in Central Asian trading posts. Travellers avoid crowded rooms more nervously. Innkeepers whisper about entire households dying within days. Doctors burn herbs desperately while admitting privately they understand very little. Fear changes how people move, how they touch one another, how they breathe inside crowded spaces. A merchant beside you coughs repeatedly during supper inside a roadside inn. Nobody says anything aloud, but several travellers quietly shift farther away along the benches. The room smells of smoke, stale wine, damp wool, and unease. Soon the stories become impossible to dismiss. Cities begin emptying. Trade slows abruptly along certain routes. Funeral grounds expand beyond their usual boundaries. The symptoms horrify witnesses: fever, swelling, pain spreading rapidly through the body, death arriving frighteningly fast for many victims. A medieval medicine possesses few effective answers. You enter a Persian city where the markets once crowded loudly from dawn until dusk. Now many stalls stand abandoned beneath drifting dust. A silence hangs over the streets, broken mainly by wagon wheels carrying bodies toward burial grounds outside the walls. Even birds seem strangely absent. People respond differently depending on culture, religion, and desperation. Some communities pray constantly, others search for scapegoats, some flee into the countryside hoping distance offers protection. Often it does not. The disease follows roads, ports, rivers, caravans. It follows human contact itself. And the Mongol world, despite growing fragmentation, still remains deeply interconnected. You continue west toward the Black Sea where Genoese merchants operate Tumdas trading colonies linked to Mediterranean commerce. Ships move goods rapidly between east and west. They also carry rats, fleas, infection. One later Sidri, repeated often though debated by historians, describes Mongol forces during the siege of Kaffa catapulting plague-infected corpses into the city. Whether entirely accurate or partly legend, the tale endured because it captured a larger truth. Disease and warfare had become entangled across these imperial networks. Eventually ships sail westward carrying plague into Europe. Then catastrophe expands almost beyond comprehension. You arrive in an Italian port city during the early waves of infection. Church bells ring endlessly through damp air heavy with salt and smoke. Priests hurry between homes giving last rites, while carts rumble through narrow streets collecting the dead. The smell becomes unforgettable. Rot, sweat, burned herbs. Fear itself almost seems to have a scent after enough time. Families lock themselves indoors. Wealthier citizens flee toward country estates if they can. Doctors wear strange protective clothing, believing foul air spreads illness. Nobody fully understands what is happening. And because people do not understand, imagination rushes into the gaps. Some believe divine punishment has arrived. Others suspect poisoned wells or foreign conspiracies. Violence erupts against vulnerable minorities in certain regions as panic seeks targets. Human beings often become cruel when frightened enough. Yet tenderness appears too. You watch a young woman carrying water carefully to sick neighbours despite obvious risk to herself. Monks continue tending the dying inside overcrowded hospitals. Parents sit beside feverish children knowing they may soon fall ill as well, and courage rarely feels dramatic up close. Usually it looks exhausted. Across Eurasia, mortality becomes staggering. Exact numbers remain debated, but historians estimate tens of millions die over successive waves of plague. Entire villages vanish. Labour shortages reshape economies. Political systems weaken under demographic collapse. And emotionally societies change. How could they not? Imagine surviving year after year while everyone around you disappears unpredictably. Friends, family, teachers, neighbours, merchants you greeted every week in the marketplace. Death becomes ordinary in terrifying ways. The Mongol Khanates suffer heavily too. Trade disruptions damage economies already strained by political fragmentation. Armies weaken, tax systems falter. Local rebellions grow more dangerous under reduced central authority. The empire built through movement now struggles partly because movement spread disaster. You sit beside a nearly empty caravan road one cold evening, watching dust drift through fading light. Years earlier, these routes overflowed with merchants and officials beneath imperial protection. Now traffic feels sparser, cautious. The great connected world of the Mongol era still exists, but something vital has broken inside it. And still life continues stubbornly. Fields must be planted, animals fed, children raised. In China, the Yuan dynasty weakens further under famine, flooding, corruption, and unrest worsened by broader instability. Secret societies and rebel movements gain support among populations exhausted by hardship. In Persia and Central Asia, competing rulers struggle maintaining authority over shrinking resources. The descendants of Genghis Khan still govern vast territories, but the confidence of earlier generations has faded into something more fragile. You realize now that empires rarely die from one wound alone. Usually many pressures accumulate together. Distance, rivalry, economic strain, disease, memory cell wearing thin across generations. And beneath darkening skies over rows once crowded with the movement of worlds, the age of Mongol unity continues slowly dissolving into history. The palaces grow quieter, not silent, never silent entirely. Servants still cross polished floors carrying trays of tea and wine. Courtiers still whisper beside painted screens. Musicians still play softly during evening banquets while lantern light trembles against lacquered walls. But the confidence is fading. You feel it first in hesitation. Rulers once certain of inherited authority now glance nervously toward rival factions. Advisors speak more carefully. Provincial governors grow bolder in ignoring distant commands. Even ceremony begins feeling slightly strained, as though everyone senses the structure weakening beneath the silk. The Mongol world has become several worlds. In China, the Yuan dynasty struggles under growing rebellion and environmental disaster. In Persia, the Ilkhanate fragments after succession crises and political instability. The Golden Horde still dominates large parts of the Western Steppe and Russian territories, but internal rivalries sharpen there too. The dream of unified empire survives mostly in memory now, and memory changes with distance. You travel first through Yuan China during the middle of the 14th century. Flooding along the Yellow River has devastated farming regions repeatedly. Famine spreads through vulnerable provinces, corruption infects local administration, while imperial officials argue endlessly over taxes and military responses. Ordinary people grow tired. That matters more than rulers often realize. You stand in a crowded grain market where prices rise daily, while anxious families count copper coins with trembling fingers. Rainwater drips steadily from roof edges into muddy streets below. A child sleeps against his mother's shoulder while she waits in line for food. Nobody here discusses grand imperial destiny. They discuss survival. Rebel movements gather support gradually among populations exhausted by hardship. Some are political, some religious, many become both at once. Secret societies promise justice, renewal, divine change. The Red Turban Rebellion spread through parts of China with growing force, and the Yuan government struggles responding effectively. The Mongols still possess military strength, but the emotional foundations of rule are weakening. Too many people feel alienated from the dynasty. Too many disasters have undermined confidence. Empire depends partly on belief. Once belief fades, force alone becomes exhausting. Meanwhile, farther west, the Ilkhanate in Persia has already fragmented badly after the death of Abd Said in 1335, without a clear heir. Rival claimants emerge. Local dynasties assert independence. Administrative unity dissolves into competing courts and shifting alliances. You move through former imperial centres where banners change frequently above government buildings. Officials pledge loyalty carefully depending on current circumstances. Merchants adapt pragmatically to whichever ruler controls taxation this month. People become flexible when the politics turns unstable. The cultural blending created during earlier Mongol rule still remains visible everywhere, though Persian art bears traces of East Asian influence. Trade routes continue functioning unevenly. Families of mixed heritage navigate identities shaped by generations of imperial exchange. The empire may fragment politically, but cultural consequences linger stubbornly. In the Golden Horde, too, power struggles intensify across the Western Steppe. Islam has become increasingly important there over generations, reshaping the identity of Mongol-descended elites. Russian principalities grow gradually stronger beneath and alongside Mongol authority, especially Moscow. You visit the city during one long winter dusk while snow falls softly across wooden rooftops. Bells ring from Orthodox churches through cold air smelling of smoke and river ice. The city is still modest compared to older capitals elsewhere, yet ambition gathers here quietly. Russian princes have spent generations learning how Mongol power functions, paying tribute, negotiating alliances, adapting administrative methods, surviving. Now some begin imagining futures less dependent on the horde. History shifts subtly before it shifts visibly. And across all these former Mongol realms, something emotional changes too. The old steppe identity weakens with each generation raised inside settled courts and urban palaces. Descendants of conquerors increasingly speak local languages as their first tongues. They marry into regional elites. They practice different religions. A prince in Persia may know little of Mongolia itself beyond inherited stories. A Yuan court official in Beijing may feel culturally distant from the Western Khanates entirely. The empire once built through movement settles gradually into separate civilizations. You spend one evening inside a fading aristocratic residence in Central Asia where elderly nobles reminisce about earlier generations. Oil lamps flicker softly while outside the wind carries dust through dark courtyards. They speak about Genghis Khan almost mythically now, about endless raids across open grasslands, about battles and loyalty and fear. You notice younger listeners watching politely but without the same emotional connection. For them, the empire has already existed, or already declined. Memory becomes thinner with time. Still, traces of Mongol influence remain everywhere you travel. Postal networks, military tactics, diplomatic connections, trade corridors, artistic exchange and demographic shifts. Even the shape of political imagination has changed. Rulers across Eurasia now understand empire differently because the Mongols demonstrated how quickly worlds could connect through force and movement. And ordinary people carry quieter inheritances too. Recipes shaped by trade, words borrowed between languages, family histories stretching unexpectedly across continents. The empire leaves fingerprints inside daily life long after political unity fractures. In China, the Yuan dynasty finally collapses in 1368 as rebel forces establish the Ming dynasty. Mongol rulers retreat northward toward the steppelands of their ancestors. There is sadness in that retreat. After generations ruling from imperial capitals, descendants of Genghis Khan ride back toward colder horizons beneath fading authority. You imagine the long movement northward through dust and silence. Wagons creaking beneath overloaded possessions, soldiers glancing backward occasionally toward lands no longer theirs. Empires end slowly, then suddenly, and beneath another vast evening sky. The Mongol world continues dissolving into separate histories while still carrying echoes of its shared beginning on the grasslands long ago. The thunder passes slowly across the steppe. Long after the great conquests end, long after unified empire dissolves into separate kingdoms and fading dynasties, the memory of Mongol power continues moving through Eurasia like distant weather, still echoing beyond the horizon. You feel it everywhere now, not as immediate a fear anymore, as inheritance. In the Russian lands, princes who once bowed carefully before Mongol envoys begin building stronger centralized states using methods partly learned from Mongol administration itself. Tax systems, military organization, political discipline. Moscow grows steadily. Church domes rise above expanding neighborhoods while merchants crowd riverside markets thick with mud during spring thaw. The city no longer feels like a vulnerable frontier settlement. Ambition hardens here. Russian rulers gradually challenge the authority of the Golden Horde more openly. Some Mongol successor states weaken through internal conflict and economic strain. Others fragment into smaller khanates competing constantly. The old unity cannot be rebuilt. Too much time has passed. Too many identities have changed. You stand beside the Ugra River in 1480, watching tense armies face one another across cold water during what later generations remember as a symbolic ending of Mongol dominance over Russia. No enormous decisive battle occurs, mostly waiting, suspicion, silence stretching across autumn fields beneath grey schemas, then eventually withdrawal. History often ends less dramatically than people expect, yet emotionally, the moment matters deeply. Centuries of Mongol political influence over Russian lands are fading into something more indirect, more historical than immediate. Still, traces remain. They will remain for generations. farther south and east. Central Asia continues evolving through shifting powers shaped partly by Mongol legacies. Turkic and Mongol identities blend across wide regions. Trade routes survive unevenly despite changing political borders. Cities rise again where earlier invasions once left devastation. Samarkand flourishes under Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, a conqueror deeply influenced by Mongol imperial traditions, though not directly descended from Genghis Khan through the main line. Timur consciously invokes Mongol prestige. That alone reveals how powerful the legacy remains. You enter Samarkand during Timur's reign and find a city dazzling with blue tilework, towering architecture, gardens fed through careful irrigation, and crowded markets alive once more with merchants from many lands. The smell of baked bread and horse sweat drifts together through warm evening air. Civilization rebuilds itself repeatedly, even after catastrophe. And in China, the Ming dynasty works aggressively to erase or minimize certain aspects of Mongol rule, while still inheriting systems shaped partly by the Yuan period. Frontier defenses strengthen, historical records are rewritten carefully, yet memory refuses complete control. Stories about the Mongols survive in villages, official histories, travelers' tales, and family traditions. Some emphasize horror, others admiration. Many combine both uneasily, because the Mongols changed too much to disappear cleanly from memory. You notice this emotional complexity everywhere. In Persia, scholars still discuss the destruction of Baghdad generations later with grief and disbelief. Yet Persian art and administration also absorbed influences that travelled through Mongol networks. In Russia, Mongol domination remains painful historically, yet political structures evolved partly through those centuries of interaction. In China, resentment toward foreign rule coexists beside technological and commercial changes intensified during the Yuan era. History rarely leaves pure legacies, only layered ones. Meanwhile, the steppe itself continues enduring beneath enormous skies much as it always has. Grass bends in cold wind, horses graze across open land, nomadic communities survive through rhythms older than empire. You return there now after this long journey across centuries. The silence feels different somehow, not empty. Reflective. You sit beside a small evening fire while distant riders move slowly across fading grasslands beneath orange sunset light. Smoke rises gently into cooling air carrying the familiar smell of wool, leather, and dry earth. This is where it began, not in palaces, not in libraries or walled capitals, in hardship, in movement, in a world where survival depended on loyalty, endurance, and the ability to adapt faster than enemies. The story of the Mongol Empire often becomes simplified into extremes, either monstrous destruction or brilliant military achievement, either barbarism or administrative genius. Reality remains more human and therefore more complicated. The empire brought unimaginable suffering to countless people. Entire cities were devastated, families shattered, cultures traumatized. That truth must remain visible. And yet the Mongols also connected civilizations across Eurasia in unprecedented ways. They accelerated exchange between distant worlds, they transformed trade, diplomacy, warfare, and political imagination itself. That truth also remains visible. You think now about Temujin as a child abandoned on the steppe after his father's death, hungry and angry, watching adults disappear when survival became inconvenient. Could anyone in that freezing landscape have imagined what would follow? Probably not. History often begins in places the world ignores, and individuals become enormous, partly because circumstances around them break apart at the right moment. Genghis Khan did not emerge from stability. He emerged from fragmentation. Perhaps that is why he understood power so clearly. Around you now, the night deepens across the grasslands. Horses breathe softly nearby. Somewhere an owl calls once into the darkness. The empire is gone, but its consequences remain stitched quietly into the modern world. Trade routes, national borders, cultural exchange, political memory, even ideas about how quickly connected systems can spread both prosperity and catastrophe. The Mongols revealed how vast the world truly was, and how vulnerable. You stare into the fire while sparks drift upward toward cold stars hanging over the same endless steppe where a forgotten boy once learned what hunger felt like beneath winter wind. Night settles gently over the grasslands. The wind moves through tall steppe grass with the same soft whisper it carried centuries ago when scattered tribes followed their herds beneath open skies, long before maps changed shape beneath Mongol hooves. You sit quietly now at the end of this long journey, watching the fire burn lower while darkness gathers across the horizon. The empire is gone. The camps vanished long ago. The great armies dispersed into history. Palaces crumbled. Dynasties fractured. Roads shifted. Rivers changed course. Entire cities disappeared beneath dust or were rebuilt so many times that memory itself became uncertain. And yet the Mongols remained strangely present, not always visibly, sometimes only as echoes. You feel them in the way Eurasia became more connected after their rise, in trade routes that linked distant civilizations more tightly than before, in diplomatic traditions shaped by imperial communication networks, in the movement of technologies, languages, religions, and ideas across enormous distances. The world after the Mongols could no longer remain entirely separate from itself. That transformation endured. So did the scars. For many communities, Mongol conquest remained a memory carried through generations with grief and fear. Stories about burning cities, mass killings, and vanished families themed it survived because trauma survives. People remember terror carefully, especially when it arrives suddenly from beyond the horizon. Yet history rarely permits simple conclusions. The same empire responsible for catastrophic violence also protected merchants across continents, encouraged cultural exchange, and created periods of remarkable commercial movement. Persian astronomy influenced Chinese scholarship. European travellers reached farther east. Medical knowledge circulated more widely. Human history often moves forward through painful contradictions. And perhaps that is part of why the Mongol story still unsettles people even now. It refuses simplicity. You think again about the emotional core beneath all these enormous events. A child abandoned after his father dies. A mother keeping her family alive through impossible winters. Friendships breaking beneath ambition. Cities waiting in fear behind closed gates. Merchants crossing deserts under cold stars. Scholars rescuing books from burning libraries. Ordinary people trying to survive while history moved violently around them. Empires are built from millions of private moments most chronicles never record. A tired soldier repairing worn boots beside a fire. A woman sharing hidden food during famine. A frightened child listening to distant hoofbeats at night. Those lives mattered too. Perhaps they matter most. Across modern Mongolia today, Genghis Khan remains a powerful national symbol, though interpretations vary widely across cultures and countries touched by Mongol expansion. Some remember him as unifier and visionary, others remember devastation first. Both memories contain truth. The steppe itself still stretches beneath enormous skies, much as it did centuries ago. Winters remain harsh there. Horses still breathe steam into freezing air. Grass still bends endlessly beneath the wind. Nature rarely cares about empires for very long. You realize that many rulers across history dreamed of permanence. Most failed. The Mongols came closer than almost anyone to binding Eurasia together beneath one political order. Yet even they could not overcome distance, succession, disease, ambition, and time itself. No empire ever has, and maybe there is something oddly comforting in that. Power passes. Cities fade. Human beings remain fragile despite every attempt at greatness. Still, people continue building, loving, trading, learning, travelling, and telling stories beneath uncertain skies, just as they always did. The fire before you burns lower now, glowing softly against the dark. Somewhere beyond the hills, horses move faintly through the night, almost invisible except for brief flashes of pale breath in the cold air. The world feels quieter here at the end. Not empty, just reflective. And perhaps that is the real legacy of the Mongol Empire, not only conquest or destruction, or even connection across continents, but the reminder that human history is never isolated. One decision beside a distant river can reshape lives thousands of miles away. One frightened child on the steppe can alter the fate of civilizations. Everything touches something else eventually. Even now, so as the night deepens around us, you leave the grasslands carrying both the beauty and the sorrow of this story together, because separating them would make the past less honest than it truly was. And somewhere beneath the same stars that once guided Mongol riders across the dark steppe, the world continues turning quietly onward. For tonight, perhaps sit with the strange scale of it all for a moment. One human life becoming large enough to reshape continents. Entire civilizations colliding, blending, surviving, grieving, rebuilding. History can feel distant when reduced to maps and dates, but when you slow down long enough, you begin noticing the people hidden inside it. The tired guards standing in freezing rain, the merchants sharing stories beside desert fires, the mothers trying to keep children calm while cities trembled around them. Those small human moments carry history forward just as much as kings and conquerors do. And if this journey across the Mongol world stayed with you tonight, I would genuinely love to hear what part affected you most. Maybe it was the loneliness of the steppe, the terrifying speed of conquests, the strange beauty of the Silk Road, or simply the reminder that empires rise and fall while ordinary people continue searching for warmth, safety, and meaning. Thank you for travelling through these centuries with me. There are many more quiet roads through history still waiting for us together.